And Sleep Like a Monk, the ancient Buddhist bedtime story that calms the mind before sleep. Chapter 1. The boy who could not sleep high in the mountains, where the air grows thin enough to make even silence feel heavy. There is a monastery built from stone the color of old bone. It has stood there for longer than anyone currently living can say with certainty. Long enough that the stone has worn smooth in the places where countless hands once rested against it. Long enough that the path leading up to its gate has been walked into a slight groove by generations of bare feet. At night, when the wind moves through the cracks in its walls, it sounds almost like breathing. Slow, patient, endless, as if the building itself were simply another sleeping creature, settled into the mountainside the way an old dog settles into a familiar corner. This is where our story begins, not with a battle or a miracle or a sermon delivered to thousands of listeners gathered beneath some great tree. Just a boy, 15 years old, lying very still under a blanket too thin for the cold, staring up at a ceiling he could not see in the dark. Oh, he had memorized by now every faint shadow the moonlight could throw across it. His name was Tenzin. 3 nights ago, he had become a novice. 3 nights ago, his head had been shaved with a blade that felt colder against his scalp than he had expected. The dark hair falling away in handfuls onto a square of cloth laid out to catch it. 3 nights ago, his clothes, the soft, worn cotton his mother had mended so many times, he knew every patch by feel, had been folded away into a chest he wasn't sure he'd ever open again, and replaced with plain robes the color of dust, rough enough at first that they'd left faint pink lines across his shoulders by the end of the first day. He had been told gently by an old monk with patient eyes that tonight, that very first night, he would sleep in the dormitory with the others, in a room full of boys he didn't yet know, under a roof that wasn't the one he'd grown up beneath. He had not slept once, not really, not in any way that counted, not the first night, when the strangeness of the robes against his skin kept startling him awake every time he shifted, the unfamiliar fabric catching where his old clothes never had, not the second night, when the sound of another novice's breathing in the dark, slow, even, untroubled, had made him feel, for reasons he couldn't quite name, more alone than he'd ever felt in his life, as though everyone else in the room had been handed some secret instruction he'd somehow missed. And not tonight, the third night, when his mind had simply refused to stop, no matter how many times he told it, silently, firmly, "Now be quiet." It moved from thought to thought the way water moves over stones in a fast-running stream, never settling, never still, picking up one worry only to drop it for the next before it had even finished forming. And if you have ever lain awake like this yourself, body exhausted all the way down to the bone, and yet the mind wide awake regardless, the two of you in some kind of quiet disagreement that neither one seems willing to lose first, then you already understand exactly how Tenzin felt in that moment. You don't need me to explain it to you in any more detail than that. You already know the particular shape of that tiredness, the way it sits behind the eyes and refuses to translate into actual sleep no matter how badly you want it to. What he didn't expect, somewhere past midnight, with the rest of the dormitory breathing evenly around him in the dark, was the soft creak of the door. He turned his head slowly, the way you move when you're not entirely sure you're allowed to be awake. An old monk stood in the doorway, lit faintly by the moon outside. No lamp, no candle, just the silver light falling across half of his face, leaving the other half in shadow. This was Ajahn Surya, the eldest teacher at the monastery, man whose age no one quite agreed on. The younger monks guessed anywhere between 70 and 90, and he never corrected anyone either way, and whose calm, as far as anyone could remember, no one had ever once seen broken, not by bad news, not by difficult novices, not even, the story went, by a fire that had once nearly taken the east wing of the building decades ago. Nobody had called him. No one had gone to fetch him. No one had mentioned that one particular novice was still awake on his third night, and yet, somehow there he was, standing in the doorway as though he'd simply known. "You're still awake," he said. It wasn't really a question, Don. His voice was low, unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't seem to need volume to carry weight. Tenzin sat up quickly, embarrassed, the way you do when someone catches you in the middle of something you didn't even realize you were doing wrong. I'm sorry, Ajahn, I'll try harder. The old monk made a small sound in response. Not quite a laugh, but close to one, something that moved through his chest more than his throat. He crossed the room slowly, the way old men do when their knees have developed strong opinions about speed and refuse to be argued with, and lowered himself down onto the floor beside Tenzin's sleeping mat, his robe settling around him in soft folds, like something with wings deciding, finally to rest, trying harder, he said, once he'd gotten comfortable. Is usually exactly how people make sleep impossible. Trying is a kind of gripping, Tenzin, and sleep doesn't come to a gripped hand, no matter how tightly you close it, no matter how determined you are. It comes to an open one, not always. There's no exception to that, not for kings, not for novices, not for anyone. Tenzin didn't fully understand what he meant, not yet. He wouldn't have admitted that out loud either, too embarrassed to seem as confused as he felt. But Ajahn Surya seemed to know it anyway, the way he always seemed to know the things people hadn't quite found the words to say. Tell me, the old monk said, shifting slightly, settling himself more comfortably against the wall, as though preparing for something that might take a while. What's keeping you awake tonight? And don't tell me nothing. Nothing doesn't keep anyone up this late, not even the most peaceful mind in the world. Something is always there, even if it's small. Tenzin hesitated. The real truth of it sat somewhere behind his ribs, heavy and shapeless. No, something he wasn't ready to say out loud to anyone, let alone to the most senior teacher in the entire monastery. Not yet. So instead, he offered the smaller, safer truth. The one that was easier to hold up to the light. I don't know how to stop thinking, he admitted. My mind just keeps going. About everything, about nothing. I don't even know what it's thinking about half the time. It just won't stop. Ajahn Surya nodded slowly, as if this answer satisfied him for the moment. As if he understood, without needing to say so, that some truths have to be approached the way you'd approach a frightened animal in tall grass, slowly, carefully. Never chased down directly, or it bolts before you ever get close enough to see it clearly. That's a good place to start, he said. Most people never even get that far in noticing, and they assume their thoughts themselves are the problem. Too many of them, too loud, too persistent. But the thoughts aren't really the problem, Tenzin. It's the chasing of them that does the damage. One thought arrives, and you run after it as though it's something you have to catch and deal with immediately. Then another comes, and you run after that one too, and by the time the sun finally rises, you've run all night and exhausted yourself completely and gone nowhere at all, because thoughts by their nature were never meant to be caught. They're meant to simply pass through the way clouds pass through a sky that never moves to chase them. Outside, somewhere beyond the thick stone wall, the wind shifted direction, and a single bell, not rung by any hand, just struck once by a gust of air against an old piece of hanging metal near the courtyard, sounded faintly through the dark, thin and clear, then gone. There is a teaching, Ajahn Surya continued, his voice settling into something almost rhythmic now, the particular cadence of someone about to tell a long story. From a very long time ago, that has nothing whatsoever to do with rules or robes, or becoming some entirely different person than the one currently lying here, exhausted on this mat. This is not a story about how to become a better monk than you currently are. This is not a story about discipline or punishment or proving anything to anyone, least of all to me, and certainly not to whatever version of yourself you're worried is watching and judging. This is a story about something far smaller and in its own way far harder than any of that. Putting a single night down. Just one night, Tenzin. Not your whole life, not your entire practice, stretching out ahead of you for years. Just tonight. Just this one stretch of darkness between now and morning. And Tenzin felt something in his chest loosen, just slightly. The way a clenched fist loosens a fraction before you've even consciously decided to let it go. "Can I ask you something?" Tenzin said, surprising himself with the question. "Do you still get nights like this? Even now, after everything?" Ajahn Surya considered this for a moment, the kind of consideration that suggested he was deciding not whether to answer honestly, but how much of the honest answer was useful to share right now. "Less often than I used to," he said. "But yes, the body doesn't stop being a body just because the mind has had decades of practice. Some nights, my knees ache too much to settle easily. Some nights, an old memory surfaces for no particular reason and wants attention I'd rather not give it at that hour. The difference now isn't that the nights stopped arriving. It's that I stopped treating each one as evidence of failure. A wakeful night even now is just weather passing through. It used to feel like a verdict." "That's hard to believe," Tenzin said. "You always seem so still." "Yes, isn't the absence of weather, Tenzin. It's just no longer mistaking the weather for the sky." He let that sit a moment. "Now, close your eyes if you'd like, even if sleep doesn't come yet. Let's see what your body is actually doing, separate from what your mind is doing. Where do you feel this wakefulness most strongly? Not the thoughts, the body." Tenzin considered. "My chest, I think, and behind my eyes." "That's common. The chest holds vigilance. It's where the body keeps watch when it doesn't trust the night to be safe. You don't need to fix that right now. Just notice it's there, the way you'd notice rain on a roof without needing to go outside and stop it." "How long have you lived here in this monastery, on this mountain?" "Longer than I sometimes remember accurately myself," Ajahn Surya said, something faintly amused in his voice. "I arrived not so differently than you did, 3 nights ago. A boy uncertain of everything, terrified of disappointing people I loved, and convinced the entire weight of some larger meaning rested on whether I managed to stay. I've watched this same room hold dozens of boys exactly like that over more years than I can cleanly count on. Some stayed the whole of their lives the way I did. Some left after a season or a year and went on to build entirely good lives elsewhere, lives that had nothing further to do with these walls. Both outcomes, in my experience, turned out fine more often than either type of boy expected, lying awake the way you are now. Does it bother you when someone leaves after you've taught them? Less than it used to when I was younger and mistook my own attachment for proper care. I've come to think the robes were never really the point, and the point was always whatever a person needed to learn while wearing them for however long they happened to wear them. Some people need this place for an entire lifetime. Others need it for exactly as long as it takes to learn 1 or 2 things, and then their path properly continues somewhere else. I try these days not to confuse my own preference for keeping students with what's actually good for the student in front of me. Tenzin found something unexpectedly settling in that admission, that even staying wasn't quite the unambiguous proof of success he'd assumed it was. "Can I ask you something else? About this place, not about me." "Of course. How old is it, actually, the monastery?" "You said you didn't always know your own age, but does anyone know how old this building is?" "Older than any single record we still have, by most estimates. Parts of the eastern wall predate even the oldest written history kept in our own archives, suggesting builders whose names were lost long before anyone thought to write them down. I find a strange comfort in that, actually, especially on nights like this one. This room, this exact stone you're lying on right now, has held countless sleepless boys before you, across more centuries than either of us can properly imagine. Some of them grew old here and died peacefully the way Sariputta did, a story you'll hear later tonight. Some left after a single season, the way I mentioned earlier, and went on to entirely different lives elsewhere. The stone itself doesn't seem to care which path any particular boy eventually took. It simply keeps offering the same modest shelter night after night, to whoever happens to need it at the time, asking nothing in return except that they pass the shelter along to whoever needs it after them. That's a strange way to think about a building, perhaps, I find it considerably more useful than thinking of it as merely stone and timber, especially at 3 in the morning, when stone and timber alone rarely feel like enough to hold the particular weight a person is carrying. There's something steadying in remembering that you're not the first frightened boy this room has ever held, and you won't be the last. The fear feels enormous and singular at 3 in the morning. The room itself has seen this exact fear, or something close enough to it, more times than either of us could count. Do you remember any of them? The other boys who couldn't sleep all those years. More than you'd guess? Oh, the details blur together after enough decades. The way faces from a single long crowd eventually blur into one another despite each having been entirely distinct in the moment. I remember a boy, now considerably younger than you are now, who cried for 3 straight nights before finally settling, convinced his mother had only sent him here because she'd stopped loving him, when in truth she'd sent him here at considerable personal sacrifice, precisely because she loved him enough to want something better for him than her own circumstances could provide. I remember another, older than you, already a grown man when he arrived, terrified not of the unfamiliar robes or the unfamiliar room, but of what it meant about the life he was leaving behind. Whether choosing this path meant his earlier choices had all been mistakes. Each of them needed something slightly different from me, in the end, the same as you do tonight. But underneath the specific shape of each fear, there's usually something close to what you're carrying right now. The simple, overwhelming sense that this particular night, this particular fear is somehow larger than anything the room has held before. Tenzin lay quietly, letting that settle, the stone beneath him suddenly feeling less like cold indifference and more like something that had simply witnessed a great deal, patiently, without judgment for a very long time. You called it dukkha once, Tenzin said quietly, remembering a lesson from his very first day here, back when everything still felt like a foreign language he was only beginning to learn. That feeling, when nothing's really wrong, exactly, nothing feels settled either. Like something slightly off, even if you can't point to what. Yes, Ajahn Surya said, something like approval in his voice. Dukkha. It's usually translated as suffering, and that translation isn't wrong exactly. But it's too big a word for what dukkha actually means most of the time on most ordinary nights like this one. Most nights, dukkha isn't suffering in any dramatic sense. It's just this, a kind of low, persistent friction. A slight wrongness that won't quite resolve no matter how you shift around it. The mat is a little too hard. The blanket is a little too thin. The night is a little too long, morning a little too far away. None of it on its own is unbearable. But all of it together, humming quietly underneath everything else, is more than enough to keep a tired body from actually resting. So how do you stop it? The old monk was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, Tenzin noticed something. A kind of weight gathering behind the old man's eyes that hadn't quite been there a moment before, as though he were deciding how much of something to share and when. I'll answer that, Ajahn Surya said slowly. Each word given room to land before the next arrived, but not with an explanation. Explanations rarely help anyone actually sleep. They just give the mind something new to chew on. I'll answer it instead with a story. In fact, before this particular night is over, I intend to tell you several stories. True ones. No, old ones that have outlived every single person who first heard them. Passed down mouth to mouth across more generations than either of us could count. And at the very end of all of them, and the fire's gone down to almost nothing and you're far too tired to keep arguing with me about any of it, I'm going to tell you one story I have never told another novice. Not once. In all my years teaching in this place, not one. Tenzin's exhaustion for just a moment gave way to something closer to curiosity, sharp and sudden, cutting through the heaviness behind his eyes. What story? Not yet, Ajahn Surya said, and there was something almost gentle in the refusal, nothing dismissive about it at all. First, you need to hear what came before it. You need to understand a few other people, much older than either of us, who also couldn't sleep, long before you or I were ever born into this world. Some of them were kings, surrounded by every comfort a kingdom could provide, and sleepless anyway. Some of them were murderers, and so frightening that entire villages fell silent at the mention of their names. One of them was a woman who walked from house to house, night after night, searching desperately for something that, as it turned out, didn't exist anywhere at all. Each one of them was kept awake by something specific, something with its own particular shape and weight, and each one of them, in their own time, in their own way, eventually found a way to put it down. He shifted his weight slightly against the wall, pulling his outer robe a little tighter against the mountain cold seeping up through the stone floor, settling himself in for whatever remained of the night. "Lie back," he said, his voice softening further. "You don't have to sleep yet. If your body isn't ready for that, you just have to listen. That's all I'm asking of you right now, nothing more." And so, with the wind still moving like breath through the old stone walls around them, and the moon laying its quiet, patient light across the narrow strip of floor between the two of them, Tenzin lay back down against his thin pillow, and Ajahn Surya began. "Let me tell you about a king," he said, "who once couldn't sleep either." Chapter 2. The king who sent for the Buddha at midnight. By now, Tenzin had stopped pretending to be calm. There was no real point in performing it any longer. Ajahn Surya had clearly noticed days ago, probably from the very first night, possibly even before Tenzin himself had fully admitted it to his own mind. And there was something almost relieving about no longer having to maintain composure for someone who already saw straight through it anyway. The way you might finally stop holding your breath once someone tells you it's all right to exhale. There was a king, Ajahn Surya began, settling fully into the rhythm of storytelling now, named Pasenadi, and he ruled over a kingdom called Kosala, a wealthy place by every measure, a successful one, with fertile land and full granaries, and a treasury that by most accounts never wanted for anything. He had soldiers loyal enough to die for him without hesitation. He had advisors clever enough to solve nearly any problem that crossed his desk. He had, in a single ordinary afternoon, more comfort available to him than most people in his kingdom would see across an entire lifetime of hard labor. "And he still couldn't sleep?" Tenzin asked, already sensing where this was likely headed, though not yet understanding why. "Worse than you," the old monk said, with the faintest trace of dry humor threading through his voice. "He went whole nights without rest, not occasionally, the way anyone might have one bad night now and then. It became a genuine pattern for him, a king pacing the empty halls of his own palace deep into the small hours, surrounded on every side by every comfort imaginable, and finding none of it the least bit useful at 3 in the morning, when the silence of the palace pressed in on him and his own thoughts grew louder than anything around him. Tenzin tried to picture it. A man who had everything, lying awake the exact same way he himself had been lying awake, just on a mat considerably less comfortable than any king's bed could possibly be. Eventually, Ajahn Surya continued. Pasenadi did something most kings of his time would never have considered doing. He sent for the Buddha in the middle of the night. Try to imagine that for a moment. A king, summoning a barefoot wandering teacher to his palace at an hour when virtually everyone else in the kingdom was asleep, simply because he could no longer bear facing another night exactly like all the ones that had come before it. And what did the Buddha tell him? He told him something the king hadn't expected to hear at all. Pasenadi had assumed reasonably enough that the problem was external to him. Too many decisions weighing on him, too many potential enemies to consider, too much responsibility resting on his shoulders for any one man to carry comfortably. The Buddha told him otherwise, gently but without hesitation, and he said there are 5 particular fires that keep a person awake at night, and that none of them, despite how it might feel, actually come from outside a person at all. Every single one of them is lit and tended from within. The old monk held up one finger in the dim light, the gesture small but deliberate. The first is tanha, craving. The thirst that simply won't let the mind rest, always reaching for the next thing, and then the thing after that, even in the dark, even when there is, quite literally, nothing left within reach to grasp at. Tanha doesn't pause for inconvenient timing. It reaches regardless of the hour. A second finger joined the first. The second is ill will, turning something over and over in the mind, again and again, every wrong ever done to you, real or only imagined, sharpening each one a little more with every pass instead of allowing any of it to dull with time, the way a wound left constantly picked at never properly heals. A third, and the third is sluggishness, a kind of thick fog that isn't quite sleep and isn't quite full waking either, where the mind drifts without any real direction and mistakes that aimless drifting for genuine rest, though it almost never actually is anything close to rest at all. A fourth. The fourth is worry, restless, circling, endlessly chewing on tomorrow and the day after that and every imagined difficulty that hasn't even happened yet and quite possibly never will. And finally the fifth, and the fifth is doubt, that quiet, persistent, gnawing question of whether any of this, any of what you're doing, any path you've chosen, is even the right one to begin with. Doubt rarely shouts. It just sits there, quietly, refusing to be fully dismissed. Tenzin felt something land heavily in his own chest as the old monk spoke, recognizing with a small jolt of discomfort at least 3 of those 5 fires burning steadily inside him at that very moment. The king, Ajahn Surya went on, watching Tenzin's face carefully, had assumed his sleeplessness came from the sheer size of his kingdom, the weight of everything he was responsible for. The Buddha told him it came instead from the size of his craving, that even a king, a man who already possessed nearly everything a person could reasonably want, could still lie awake all night chasing something his hands would never actually manage to hold on to. Tanha doesn't care how much a person already has. It only ever knows how to reach for more, regardless of how full the hands already are. What did the king do once he heard that? He listened. That's really all, at first. Simply listened and let the teaching sit with him rather than demanding an immediate fix. He didn't become a monk himself. He didn't give away his kingdom or abandon his throne. He simply began, each night from then on, to notice which of the 5 fires happened to be burning in him on any given evening, rather than assuming, as he always had before, that the night itself was simply against him, some force working to deny him rest out of spite, and that noticing, it turned out, over time, was most of the actual work required. There's a particular detail in the old accounts that I've always found worth keeping, Ajahn Surya added. Pasenadi didn't simply decide once and for all that he understood the 5 fires, then move on as though the matter were closed. Some nights, lying awake, he would name them out loud to himself quietly, almost like a private inventory. Craving, ill will, sluggishness, worry, doubt, checking each one against whatever he was actually feeling, the way you might check a list of provisions before a long journey. Often, 2 or 3 of them were burning at once, angled together so closely it took real patience to tell where one ended and the next began. But the naming itself, even when it didn't immediately bring sleep, seemed to loosen something. A fire you can name is rarely quite as large as a fire you can only feel. Tenzin lay quietly, turning this over slowly in his mind. Outside, the wind had calmed somewhat, as though it too had paused to listen along with him. Would it help, Ajahn Surya offered, to actually try it right now, the way Pasenadi eventually learned to? Not to solve anything tonight, just to practice the noticing itself. I think so. I don't really know how, though. It's simpler than it sounds. I'll name each fire slowly, and you tell me, honestly, whether it's burning in you at all tonight, even a little. There's no wrong answer. Tanha. Craving. Is there something you're reaching for right now, wanting this night to be different than it is? Tenzin considered. I want to already be asleep. I keep reaching for that. That's craving, plainly enough. Wanting the present moment replaced by some future one. Ill will next. Anyone you're holding something against tonight, turning over and over? No, not really. Maybe myself a little for not sleeping. That counts. Ill will doesn't require another person as its target. Plenty of it gets aimed inward. Sluggishness? I don't think so. I'm too awake for that one. Fair. Worry then, and I suspect I already know this answer. That one's the worst, Tenzin admitted. About failing, about my family, and doubt whether any of this is even the right path for you. Tenzin was quiet for a long moment, some nights more than others, tonight a little. So craving, a touch of ill will turned on yourself, worry running hottest of the five, and a small ember of doubt underneath it. That's an honest accounting and an entirely ordinary one. Notice you didn't need to extinguish a single one of them just now, simply by naming them out loud. They're all still here, but they take up slightly less room than they did 5 minutes ago. None, simply because you can finally see their actual shapes instead of one undifferentiated wall of awake. Will it always take this long? Naming each one at a time. At first, yes, mostly. It's a skill the same as any other, and like any skill, it's slower and more deliberate when it's new. In time, the naming happens faster, almost automatically, sometimes in less time than it takes to draw a single breath. You'll simply notice one day that you caught a fire forming before it had fully caught hold. The way you might notice a kettle starting to whistle before it's reached its loudest point. That doesn't mean the fires stop arriving. People sometimes hope for that, expecting practice to eventually produce a mind that simply doesn't generate craving or worry anymore. I've never met anyone for whom that turned out to be true in all my years here. What changes isn't the arriving. It's how quickly you can see clearly what's arrived and how much less unnecessary suffering you add on top of it once you can. Did Pasenadi ever stop being a king after all this? Did he give it up entirely? No, the way some people might expect. No, and I think that detail matters more than people often realize when they first hear this story. He remained king for the rest of his reign, continued making the ordinary decisions a king has to make, continued carrying real responsibility for an entire kingdom's welfare. The teaching never asked him to abandon his position, only to stop mistaking his position as the actual source of his sleeplessness. That's worth remembering, especially for you. 3 nights into wearing robes you're not yet certain you should be wearing. The teaching doesn't require you to leave anything behind, necessarily. It only asks you to look honestly at what's actually keeping you from rest, rather than assuming the robes themselves or the mountain, or any external circumstance, is to blame for something that was, all along, burning quietly from within. Did the Buddha and the king stay close after that night, or was it just one visit, one teaching, and then nothing further? And they reportedly maintained a long friendship afterward, by most accounts an unusually close one for a king and a wandering teacher with no formal claim on royal time. Pasenadi would visit him periodically over the following years, sometimes for further teaching, sometimes apparently just to sit together in companionable silence, the way old friends sometimes do without needing every visit to produce some new insight. There's an account, late in both their lives, of Pasenadi remarking that he found something remarkable in noticing how the Buddha, despite being considerably older than him by that point, seemed somehow to look younger with each passing year, his face settling into ever greater ease rather than the usual wear time brings most of us. Whether that's literal description or simply Pasenadi's own poetic way of describing the visible effect of decades of practiced peace, I can't say for certain, but I find the image itself worth holding on to regardless. The idea that genuine practice might, over enough years, actually soften a face rather than harden it, the opposite of what most of us assume aging inevitably does to anyone carrying real responsibility. Did Pasenadi die at peace in the end, the way Sariputta did, the way you said earlier? A historical record on that point is less complete than I'd like, if I'm honest with you. Some accounts suggest a peaceful end befitting everything he'd learned. Others note that his final years were complicated by political turmoil within his own kingdom, including by some versions, a coup led by his own son. I mention this not to undercut the teaching, but because I think it's important you understand something clearly. This early in tonight's stories, learning to see your own five fires clearly doesn't necessarily protect you from every difficult circumstance life might still arrange around you. It protects something different, something perhaps more valuable in the long run. Your relationship to whatever difficulty does arrive, rather than guaranteeing the difficulty itself will simply stay away out of respect for your practice. That seems almost unfair, though. If he did everything right, shouldn't that count for something? In terms of what actually happens to him, I understand the instinct behind that question completely. It's one I asked myself plenty of times in my own younger years, usually at hours not so different from this one. But I think the unfairness only feels that way if we assume practice is meant to function like a transaction, good behavior, purchasing good outcomes the way coins purchase goods at a market stall. And it was never quite that kind of exchange, however much we might wish it were. What practice actually offers is considerably stranger, and I'd argue considerably more valuable than guaranteed comfortable outcomes. The capacity to meet whatever does happen, comfortable or not, fair or not, without that meeting being entirely defined by panic or despair. Asanati, facing a coup with the same clear-eyed steadiness he'd learned to face his own sleeplessness with, even if the coup itself succeeded, and even if it cost him his throne, would still represent something the five fires teaching had genuinely given him. The teaching was never a shield against difficulty arriving. It was always a way of meeting difficulty once it inevitably did. He listened. That's all, really, at first. Anika, Ajahn Surya said softly, almost to himself, the word settling into the quiet room like a small stone dropped gently into still water. Impermanence. Even the very worst night a person can imagine doesn't last forever, no matter how endless it feels while you're inside it. Even the most restless, frantic mind eventually runs out of things to chase, the way a child eventually tires itself out after running in circles long enough. The king learned, slowly, that the fire only ever feels eternal while it's actively burning. It never actually is eternal. Not once, not for anyone. He paused, watching Tenzin's face carefully in the dim, silvery light. Outside, somewhere past the dormitory wall, a night bird called once, twice, then fell silent, as though even it had decided the hour had grown too late for further commentary. The monastery around them had gone almost entirely still now. No footsteps in the corridors, no distant voices from the kitchen where, earlier in the evening, the younger monks had been preparing rice for the morning meal. Just the two of them, the faint orange glow of the brazier, and the particular hush that only ever settles over a place deep enough into the night. You know, Ajahn Surya added, almost as an aside, Pasenadi's palace would have had guards posted at every door that night, servants asleep in nearby rooms, an entire household built around making sure the king never wanted for anything. And none of it mattered in the slightest. Once those five fires were lit, a guard can't stand watch over a craving. A servant can't fetch water for doubt. The five fires don't respect rank or wealth or how many people are nearby to help. They only ever answer to being seen clearly, which is a different kind of attention altogether than the kind a palace can provide. He paused, watching Tenzin's face carefully in the dim silvery light. So tell me, he said gently, his voice carrying no pressure in it at all. Which fire is burning in you tonight, Tenzin? You don't have to answer yet if you're not ready. But I think somewhere underneath everything else, you already know exactly which one it is. Tenzin opened his mouth to answer, and then closed it again almost immediately. The truth sat right there, just behind his teeth, close enough to taste, and still, somehow, he couldn't quite manage to let it out into the open air between them. Ajahn Surya didn't push any further. He simply nodded, as though this hesitation too was entirely expected, as though he understood that some truths genuinely do take more than a single story to loosen their grip enough to finally be spoken. If you've ever felt that same particular hesitation yourself, a truth sitting right at the very edge of being spoken aloud, and some old, deeply worn habit of caution holding it back for just one more moment, one more breath. You might want to take this opportunity right now to write in the comments which of those 5 fires feels most familiar to you tonight. Sometimes simply naming a thing, even to strangers, even in the middle of the night, is the very first ember of finally letting it go. "It's all right," Ajahn Surya said, after the silence had stretched on long enough to feel complete rather than uncomfortable. "Don't have to tell you yet, but I think before we go any further, you should hear about a man who made the exact opposite mistake from Pasanades. A man who didn't chase comfort at all, not even slightly, none, but instead pushed himself so relentlessly hard against his own body that he very nearly broke it beyond repair." Tenzin shifted slightly under his blanket, pulling it a little higher against the cold settling into the room now that the conversation had slowed. "There was a disciple," the old monk continued, his voice dropping into the particular register he used when beginning something he considered important, "who made a vow in front of everyone that he would never sleep again. Never." Chapter 3. The monk who vowed never to sleep again. Ajahn Surya let the silence sit for a long moment before continuing, as he often did. He was good at that, letting silence do some of the teaching on its own. A way a held breath sometimes communicates more than any words that might follow it ever could. "His name was Anuruddha," he said finally. "He was one of the Buddha's own close disciples, aptly devoted in a way that went well beyond ordinary diligence. Perhaps too devoted in the end for his own good." "What was he like before all of this happened to him?" "Privileged, by most accounts. Born into a wealthy family, raised in a manner so sheltered that he reportedly didn't know, well into his youth, that rice had to be grown before it could be eaten, or that food simply appeared because someone had labored to produce it. He gave all of that up readily enough when he chose to follow the Buddha, which tells you something about the sincerity underneath his later excess. It wasn't that he lacked genuine devotion. It was that devotion in him had nowhere gentle to land. Everything he attempted entirely, with no instinct at all for moderation, none, because moderation had never once been required of him in his earlier life. When he finally found something worth devoting himself to completely, he simply applied the only intensity he'd ever known. One day, while the Buddha himself was teaching directly in front of him, Anuruddha fell asleep. It happens to everyone eventually. Even monks, even the most dedicated and disciplined among them. Not even people who would never in 1,000 years have predicted it happening to them. But Anuruddha was so deeply ashamed of it, so utterly humiliated by his own ordinary human tiredness in that moment, that he made a vow right there on the spot, in front of the Buddha and everyone else gathered to listen. He swore that he would never sleep again, not for the rest of his life. "Is that even possible?" Tenzin asked, genuinely uncertain. For a while, terrifyingly, it appeared to be. He kept his vow with a kind of ferocious discipline that most people, hearing about it secondhand, would call deeply admirable. Days passed this way, then weeks. He refused every single urge to close his eyes, fighting against his own body's most basic needs the way you might fight against a determined enemy who refuses to back down, and slowly, inevitably, his eyes, which had never once been allowed even a moment's genuine relief in all that time, began to fail him completely. He started, quite literally, going blind. Tenzin's stomach tightened uncomfortably at the thought. Because he wouldn't sleep at all? Because he confused punishment with discipline, Ajahn Surya said, his voice carrying a note of old sadness in it. He had come to believe that forcing himself harder was the same thing as practicing well, that the two were simply interchangeable. He believed the cost, whatever it turned out to be, didn't matter in the slightest, as long as the vow itself remained unbroken. The Buddha, when he eventually learned what was happening to his disciple, didn't praise him for his devotion, the way Anuruddha had perhaps hoped he might. He was troubled by it, not genuinely concerned. He went to Anuruddha directly and told him something that apparently surprised everyone within hearing distance. that sleep itself is not some kind of moral failing to be overcome through sheer willpower, and that a body requires rest in exactly the same way a fire requires air to keep burning, not because the body is somehow weak or lacking in discipline, but simply because that is what a body fundamentally is, regardless of how devoted the mind attached to it happens to be. So he finally stopped the vow. Eventually, yes, though by that point, the damage already done to his eyes could not be undone. Some accounts suggest he never fully recovered his sight for the rest of his life. But what he did recover in the process was something far more valuable than ordinary vision. He learned the lesson sitting just underneath all that unnecessary suffering, that there exists a fire-like kind of trying. All force and friction and self-punishment. There exists an entirely different, tuning-like kind of trying, and the two are not remotely the same thing, no matter how similar they might appear from the outside. Sita, the heart-mind, cannot be forced into genuine stillness any more successfully than a frightened animal can be forced into calm by shouting at it or chasing it down. It has to be met, instead, gently, patiently, entirely on its own terms, in its own time. You mentioned earlier he developed something called the divine eye. What does that actually mean if it isn't simply ordinary sight returning? Odd. Different traditions describe it differently, and I won't pretend to settle the question definitively for you tonight. None. Some describe it as a literal capacity to perceive things beyond the range of ordinary vision, the unfolding of cause and effect across lifetimes, that sort of claim. And others read it more as a metaphor for the unusually clear insight he developed into his own mind and the minds of those around him. A perceptiveness that had nothing to do with the eyes at all. And I tend toward the second reading myself, though I hold it loosely. What I find genuinely useful in the story isn't settling that particular debate. It's noticing the shape of it. Something was taken from him in one domain, and something else not identical but not unrelated either, grew in its place. That pattern shows up often enough, in enough different lives, that it seems worth trusting even when we can't fully explain the mechanism. A brazier popped softly, a small ember shifting, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Tenzin found himself thinking of Anuruddha's eyes, not the blindness itself exactly, but the particular kind of devotion that had caused it, a devotion so fierce it had forgotten, somewhere along the way, that it was supposed to be in service of something gentler than the suffering it produced. Did he regret it? Zin asked. Afterward, I mean, once he understood what he'd done to himself. By most accounts, less than you'd expect, Ajahn Surya said. Grief, perhaps, not for what the blindness cost him in ordinary terms. He could no longer see a sunrise, or a friend's face, or the particular color robes turn in late afternoon light, but not regret for the devotion itself, not only for having aimed it so badly. He went on, in time, to develop what the old texts call the divine eye, a different kind of seeing altogether, one that had nothing to do with light entering the eyes at all, none. Whether you take that literally or as a way of describing some deeper clarity he found afterward, the lesson underneath it stays the same either way. What he lost in one direction, he eventually recovered, multiplied in another. But only once he stopped fighting his own body as though it were the enemy. Did he ever talk about the moment he understood what he'd done wrong? Or did it come to him slowly the way most things seem to? And there's a particular account of the Buddha sitting with him directly after the worst of it had become clear, and using an image I've always found useful enough to pass along myself. And he compared Anuruddha's mistake to a man trying to cross a river by refusing to use the boat provided, swimming instead with everything he had, exhausting himself entirely, when the boat had been sitting right there the whole time, requiring nothing more than stepping into it. The effort wasn't wasted exactly. It proved his sincerity beyond any doubt. But sincerity alone doesn't get a person across a river any faster than swimming foolishly does, when a boat was always the better tool for the crossing. Anuruddha, hearing that, reportedly laughed at himself for the first time in months. Sometimes the turn toward healing starts exactly there, with a person finally able to laugh gently at their own excess, rather than continuing to defend it, as though laughing at it would somehow undo all the sincere effort that came before. Is that hard? Laughing at yourself, I mean, after taking something so seriously. Harder than it sounds and easier than you'd fear once you actually manage it the first time. Most people, in my experience, resist laughing at their own excess because they mistake it for laughing at their own sincerity, as though the two were the same thing. They aren't. You can have meant something completely seriously with your whole heart and still have gotten the method badly wrong. Laughing at the method doesn't insult the sincerity behind it. If anything, it frees the sincerity to try again, more wisely, the next time it's needed. And what did Aniruddha do with the rest of his life, once he'd recovered from all of it, as much as he ever fully recovered? Did the vow change how he taught others later on? By most accounts, considerably, and in a direction you might not immediately expect. Rather than becoming someone who counseled extreme caution against any kind of devoted effort, having seen firsthand where unchecked devotion could lead, he apparently became known for a particular skill in helping other monks find precisely that delicate tuning Sona would later describe with his string. He'd seen the fire-like trying from the inside, in its most extreme and costly form, and so he could recognize its earliest in someone else long before that person had done any lasting damage to themselves. There's an account of him gently stopping a younger monk one evening simply by asking whether the monk's current effort felt more like devotion or more like punishment, a question that apparently startled the younger man into recognizing for himself that he'd drifted considerably further into the second category than he'd realized. Aniruddha's blindness, in other words, didn't make him afraid of intensity in others. It made him unusually skilled at helping people find the right amount of it before they paid the same price he once had. Tenzin felt, for just a moment, the smallest flicker of something like the laugh Aniruddha must have had, considering his own rigid 3 nights of trying so hard to force sleep that sleep had simply refused to come anywhere near him. Tenzin thought of his own 3 sleepless nights in a row, how hard he had been trying this entire time, lying rigid and tense in the dark, gripping desperately at sleep the exact way you might grip at a rope rapidly slipping through your hands. The harder you squeeze, the faster it seems to escape. I think I've been doing something like what Aniruddha did, he admitted quietly, almost embarrassed to say it out loud. Just smaller, I suppose, trying so hard not to fail at any of this that I can't actually manage to rest at all. Ajahn Surya looked at him for a long, quiet moment, something gentle and unhurried moving behind his eyes. "Say the rest of it," he said softly, his tone carrying no pressure, only patient invitation. "You've been circling around it now for 3 full nights." And finally, Tenzin let it out. "I'm afraid I'll fail," he said, the words coming faster now that the very first one had finally broken free of whatever had been holding it back. Not just at this one thing, at all of it. The robes, the vows, every single part of this life I'm supposed to be starting. And if I fail, I'll have to go home, and everyone there will know exactly why. My family will have given up so much, sacrificed so much for absolutely nothing, and I'll have been the reason none of it worked out, and He stopped abruptly, breathing hard, as though he had just run somewhere at full speed instead of simply speaking a few sentences aloud in the dark. Ajahn Surya didn't rush in to comfort him immediately. He let the words settle in the cold night air for a while first, the way you might let smoke clear from a room before speaking again into it. "Thank you for saying that," he said finally, his voice gentle but entirely sincere. "That's the heaviest thing you've been carrying around with you tonight, and you've just managed to put a little of it down, simply by finally speaking it out loud to another person instead of carrying it alone. Does it ever go away completely? The fear of failing? In my experience, less than people hope, more than people fear. It changes shape more than it disappears outright. What I can tell you honestly is that the version of failure you're picturing right now shame, your family's disappointment at going home in defeat has almost never matched what actually happens to the novices I've watched leave over the years, even the ones who did eventually leave. Most families, faced with the reality of a son returning home, are considerably more relieved to have him back than disappointed he didn't finish. The fear tonight is doing more work in your head than the actual outcome, whichever way it goes, is likely to do in your life. Tenzin felt unexpected tears threaten at the corners of his eyes and blinked them back firmly, embarrassed all over again. I'm not going to tell you that fear is somehow wrong to feel, Ajahn Surya continued. It isn't wrong. Not. It's simply present, the way weather is present, whether anyone wants it there or not. But I want to tell you now about another disciple, a man almost destroyed in his own time, not by sleeping too little the way Anuruddha was, but by trying far too hard in a slightly different direction entirely. A musician, actually, before he ever wore a single robe. He reached toward the small clay brazier set between them, not stirring the dying coals carefully with a thin stick kept nearby for exactly this purpose, coaxing a little more warmth and faint orange light from what little remained of the fire. He played the lute so beautifully, Ajahn Surya said, watching the small flame catch and steady, that people from neighboring villages, sometimes from quite far away, would travel considerable distances just for the chance to hear him play even once. And when he eventually became a monk himself, leaving that old life behind, he brought every single ounce of that same fierce intensity along with him into his new practice, and very nearly destroyed himself completely in the process of trying to apply it. Chapter 4. The lute player's string. The fire between them had burned down to almost nothing now, just a faint orange glow beneath a soft bed of gray ash, and neither of them moved right away to feed it. There was something about the dimness, the way it pulled the edges of the room into shadow and left only the small space immediately around them lit, that seemed to suit the story Ajahn Surya was about to tell. Tenzin had noticed, by now, that the old monk seemed to choose his stories partly by the quality of light available to tell them in, as though some stories needed brightness and others needed exactly this, a single ember, just enough to see a face by. His name was Sona Kolivasa, Ajahn Surya said, settling back against the wall. Before he ever shaved his head or took a single vow, and he was known across his entire region as one of the finest lute players anyone had ever heard play. People said his fingers understood the strings in a way most people barely understand their own hands, that he could find, without searching, the exact pressure and angle that turned ordinary sound into something that made grown men weep at festivals. He came from considerable wealth, too, by most accounts, his family among the most prosperous in the region, his own feet, the old stories claim, so accustomed to soft floors that fine hair was said to grow on the soles of them, a small detail meant to illustrate just how far removed he'd been from any kind of hardship before he chose to leave it all behind. That detail matters for what comes next, because it means his later self-punishment wasn't the desperation of someone with nothing left to lose. He had everything to lose, materially speaking, and walked away from it willingly. What he hadn't yet learned to walk away from was the belief that suffering itself was the price of seriousness. And then he became a monk, Tenzin said, already sensing the shape of where this story might be heading. And he brought every single ounce of that same fierce intensity along with him into his new life. He reasoned, in the particular way ambitious people often reason, that if devotion to music had made him excellent at music, then an even greater devotion to spiritual practice would surely make him enlightened, and faster than anyone else, if only he pushed harder than anyone else had ever pushed before him. So that is exactly what he did. He meditated for so many consecutive hours that his feet bled from pacing the same narrow stretch of ground over and over. He refused anything resembling proper sleep, treating exhaustion as a kind of badge rather than a warning. He drove himself the way you might drive an animal you had decided in advance you would never need to rely on again. Did any of it work? It very nearly destroyed whatever joy he had ever found in practice in the first place. He grew exhausted in a way that went past the body and settled into something closer to the spirit, bitter, in time, and worst of all, by his own private accounting, no closer to the peace he had set out chasing than he had been on his very first day. One particular night, sitting alone, utterly spent in every sense of the word, a single thought crossed his mind with a clarity that frightened him more than any physical pain had. Perhaps I would have done better to simply stay home, enjoy the wealth my music had earned me, give generously when I could, make whatever merit I was able to in far simpler ways than this. That, Tenzin, is despair speaking, not laziness, despite how easily the two can be confused from the outside. Despair, dressed up convincingly as nothing more than reasonable common sense. Tenzin recognized something of himself in that description, the particular late-night logic that whispers, maybe none of this is worth what it's costing you, delivered always in the calm, persuasive voice of someone simply being sensible. The Buddha came to him directly, Ajahn Surya continued, having heard, through whatever quiet channels carried such news through the community, that one of his most devoted disciples was suffering in this particular way. He asked Sona something deceptively simple. Back when you still played the lute, before any of this, what happened to music if the strings were tuned too tight? They'd snap, Tenzin said, or go sharp and ugly before they snapped. Yes, and what happened if the strings were left too loose instead? No real sound at all. Just nothing worth listening to. Exactly right. The Buddha told him that practice works according to precisely the same principle. Tune the string too tight, and you destroy yourself trying to force something open through sheer, relentless will alone. Leave the string too loose, and nothing meaningful happens at all. You simply drift, directionless, mistaking ease for progress. The actual work was never about applying more effort or less effort, as though those were the only two available choices. The actual work is tuning, finding the precise, particular tension at which the string can finally make the sound it was always capable of making, not the sound it was strung to make in the first place. This is not about trying harder, Tenzin. This is not about trying less either, as though the absence of effort were somehow the secret answer. This is not, in the end, really about effort at all, not in the way most people understand that word. This is about tuning, patient, careful tuning, and tuning takes a kind of close, sustained attention that has almost nothing to do with force, everything to do with listening closely enough to notice when something is finally right. Virya, Ajahn Surya said, the word settling softly into the dim room. Right effort. Most people hear the word effort and immediately assume it means pushing harder, gritting the teeth, forcing something through by sheer determination. It doesn't, not entirely, and certainly not always. And it means matching the energy you bring to whatever a particular moment genuinely needs. Sometimes considerably more than you'd expect, and sometimes, just as often, considerably less. And sukha, ease, isn't somehow the opposite of effort, as people often assume. The two were never enemies to begin with. A properly tuned string makes it sound easily without strain the moment it's struck. That ease isn't laziness in disguise. It's precision arrived at honestly. Is there a way to know in the moment whether you're tuning or just telling yourself you're tuning when you're actually just giving up? And that's the harder question, and I won't claim there's a perfectly reliable test. But here's something close to one. Giving up tends to come with a kind of relief that has an edge of avoidance in it, a wanting to not be here anymore, doing this thing. Genuine tuning, even when it asks you to ease off, tends to come with relief that feels more like arriving than escaping. The first kind wants distance from the moment. The second kind wants to actually be more present in it, just without the unnecessary strain. It's a subtle difference, and you'll get it wrong sometimes before you get it right consistently. That's allowed too. Did Sona ever pick the lute back up after he became a monk? Or did he leave that part of himself behind entirely once he'd found the right tuning? There's no clear record either way. As far as I know, though I've always rather hoped he did, even briefly, even once. There's something fitting about imagining him, years later, settled and at peace, picking up an instrument again purely for the simple pleasure of the sound, with none of the old desperate need attached to it anymore. Not performing for anyone, not proving anything, just letting his hands remember what they'd once loved doing before love had curdled into compulsion. On. Whether that actually happened or not, I think it's worth holding as a possibility, because it points at something true regardless. Giving up the broken way of doing a thing doesn't necessarily mean giving up the thing itself. And sometimes it simply means finally getting to enjoy it properly for the first time. There is something that happens in the body almost without permission, and this particular understanding finally lands. When effort stops fighting against the present moment and simply learns instead to meet it. The breath softens almost entirely on its own, without anyone deciding to make it soften. The shoulders, which have likely been quietly braced for hours without your conscious awareness, finally remember that they are, in fact, allowed to drop. This isn't something that needs to be forced into happening through more effort. It happens reliably the very moment all that unnecessary forcing finally fully stops. Tenzin felt his own shoulders in that moment and realized, with a small flicker of surprise, that they had been raised nearly to his ears for longer than he could account for. Did he go on to teach others afterward? About the string, I mean. Not, did he pass it along the way you're passing it along to me now? By most accounts, extensively, and apparently with unusual skill, or precisely because he'd lived the mistake himself rather than only studying it from a comfortable distance. There's a particular kind of teacher, Tenzin, who can only describe the destination, having never personally walked the difficult road that leads there. And there's another kind, considerably rarer and considerably more useful, who can describe every specific wrong turn along the way, because they took each one themselves before finding the right path. Sona became the second kind. Younger monks reportedly sought him out specifically when they recognized in themselves the particular flavor of desperate, self-punishing effort he'd once nearly destroyed himself with, because he, unlike some of the more naturally serene teachers, could meet that specific desperation without flinching from it or moralizing about it. He simply said, "Not plainly, I know this string. I broke it myself once. Let me show you what I eventually learned about the tuning." Is that why you're telling me all of this tonight? Because you broke your own string once too? Ajahn Surya considered the question for a long moment, the brazier's faint light catching the lines of his face. Partly, yes. I think every story I'm telling you tonight is one I either lived through some smaller version of myself or watched closely enough in someone else that it left its own mark on me. I'm not simply reciting old texts at you, however much it might sound that way at 3 in the morning. I'm handing you whatever proved actually useful across however many years it took me to learn it properly myself. So Sona finally stopped pushing so hard against himself. He stopped confusing devotion with violence directed at himself. Yes. How do you actually tell the difference, though? In the moment, I mean. Effort feels like effort, odd. Whether it's the right kind or the wrong kind, a fair question, and not an easy one to answer cleanly. But here's a rough test I've found useful over the years. Forced effort tends to leave you more depleted the longer you sustain it. It borrows energy from tomorrow to pay for tonight. Tuned effort tends to leave you, if not energized exactly, at least intact. Not necessarily easy, mind you. Patakara's feet, which you'll hear about soon enough, took considerable effort to walk all that distance. But it was effort in service of something, rather than effort spent fighting against something. Ask yourself, next time you're pushing hard at anything, am I moving toward what this moment actually needs, or am I simply punishing myself for not already being somewhere else? The two can look identical from the outside. They rarely feel identical from the inside once you know to check. And not very long after that shift, he found exactly what he had been chasing all along, though not through force this time. through finally allowing the string to settle at precisely the right tension instead. He became in time one of the most deeply respected among all the Buddha's disciples, known specifically for the eloquence of his teaching on right effort, not because he had tried harder than everyone else around him, because he had finally, after everything, learned when and how to stop. A long pause settled comfortably between them. Outside, somewhere past the window, a faint sound moved through the dark, a thin, dragging creak, irregular, almost rhythmic in its unevenness, and Tenzin's whole body went rigid at the sound, every muscle tensing at once. "What was that?" he whispered, his voice suddenly much smaller than it had been a moment before. Ajahn Surya's eyes flicked briefly toward the window, unhurried, entirely unconcerned, then returned just as calmly to Tenzin's face. "I'll show you what it is," he said, "but not yet. There's one more story that needs to come first, and I think you'll understand, by the time it's finished, exactly why the order matters. If tonight's particular story has found something true in you, if you recognized your own string somewhere in Sona's struggle, not whether too tight or too loose, I'd genuinely like to hear about it. Tell me in the comments which of tonight's fires feels closest to the one actually keeping you awake right now. And if stories like this one help your own mind settle toward rest, you're welcome to stay a while longer. There's a new story like this one most weeks, for whichever particular night you happen to need it most." And Tenzin pulled the thin blanket a little tighter around himself, still listening carefully for the sound outside, though it had gone quiet again almost as soon as it had started. "Tell me about the woman, then," Ajahn Surya said, somewhat to himself, as though only now deciding the proper order in which all these stories needed to unfold. "The one who heard a single sentence just once and understood everything contained inside it before the sentence had even finished being spoken." And Chapter 5, the man who heard it just once. Ajahn Surya hadn't forgotten about the sound outside the window. Tenzin could tell as much from the way the old monk's gaze drifted toward it now and then. A particular kind of glance you give something you're keeping a careful, quiet eye on without wanting to draw attention to the checking itself. But he clearly wasn't ready to name it yet, not directly, not until whatever remained of the night's careful arrangement had played itself out properly. "Actually," he said, gently correcting his earlier promise, "let me tell you about the man first before the woman." Bahia was his name, Bahia Daruchiriya, which translates roughly to Bahia dressed in bark. That description wasn't poetic exaggeration. It was exactly what he wore, day after day, year after year. And he had spent the better part of his adult life as a wandering ascetic, practicing increasingly extreme austerities, entirely convinced that enough deliberate suffering would eventually burn away whatever stood between himself and lasting peace. Did any of that suffering actually work in the end? No better than Sona's relentless effort had worked for him. One day, quite unexpectedly, a spirit, or so the old texts describe it, though you're free to understand that detail however suits you best, told him plainly, without any particular ceremony, that despite everything he'd put his body through, he wasn't actually enlightened at all. And rather than denying this or growing defensive, the way most people might have reacted, Bahia did something genuinely remarkable instead. He believed the warning immediately without argument and set off at once with real urgency to find someone who might actually be capable of teaching him properly. Did he find the Buddha? He found him on an alms round, walking with characteristic calm from house to house, collecting whatever food was offered in complete silence, as was the custom for that particular practice. And what was Bahia like before any of this? Was he always so desperate for an answer? By most accounts, he'd actually been mistaken earlier in his life, not for someone who'd already achieved full liberation. Sailors he'd once traveled with, impressed by his austerity, had begun treating him as an enlightened teacher, and rather than correcting them, he'd let the assumption stand, perhaps believing privately that the practice itself would eventually catch up to the reputation. It never did, of course, which is presumably why the warning that finally reached him landed as hard as it did. And there's something worth noticing in that detail. He'd spent years accepting praise for an attainment he didn't actually have, and the discomfort of that gap, once he could no longer ignore it, is likely what gave his final question to the Buddha its desperate edge. Pretending to have already arrived somewhere can be its own particular kind of exhausting, perhaps more exhausting, in the end, than simply admitting you haven't gotten there yet. Have you ever done that? Let people believe something about you that wasn't quite true, because correcting them felt harder than letting it stand. Ajahn Surya laughed quietly at that, a real laugh, the kind that suggested the question had landed somewhere genuine. More than once, certainly, in smaller ways than Bahia's. Novices arrive here sometimes already convinced, before they've even properly met me, that the eldest teacher on the mountain must have everything figured out, must never struggle with anything they themselves struggle with. It would be easy enough to simply let that assumption stand, to play the part rather than correct it, especially since playing the part requires considerably less vulnerability than admitting otherwise. I try not to, though I won't claim I've always succeeded. Tonight, telling you about my own sleepless night at the Hermitage is partly an attempt to correct that particular pretense directly, rather than letting it quietly continue the way it's easier to let it continue. Why tell me, though, out of everyone you've taught? Because you asked the right question at the right moment, mostly, and because something in how you've carried yourself tonight, honestly enough to admit your fear of failing, honestly enough to laugh at the well rope once you understood what it actually was, suggested you were ready to hear it as something other than simple reassurance. Bahia needed someone willing to finally tell him the bark and austerity approach wasn't working. I think in a smaller way, you needed someone willing to admit that the easy version of me, endlessly calm, never once afraid, was never quite the whole truth either. Bahia, desperate and entirely without patience left for ceremony, interrupted him directly, which simply wasn't done under any normal circumstance. You did not interrupt a respected teacher in the middle of an alms round, but Bahia begged anyway, his urgency overriding every consideration of proper conduct. He said, quite plainly, please teach me right now, this very moment, because I might very well die before I ever get another opportunity like this one. What did the Buddha say in response? At first, he gently declined, twice in fact, each time testing in his own quiet way, whether Bahia's evident urgency was genuine spiritual readiness or simply a kind of frightened panic dressed up to look like readiness. But Bahia insisted a third time with the same unwavering intensity, and something in the sheer sincerity of that third insistence finally convinced the Buddha to answer him directly. And the teaching he offered was barely longer than a single unhurried breath. In the seeing, let there be simply the seen. In the hearing, simply the heard. In the sensing, simply the sensed. In the knowing, simply the known. Nothing added on top of any of it, nothing extra layered in afterward. Just the bare moment itself, exactly as it actually is, without the mind reaching in immediately to decorate it with an entire unnecessary story. That's it. That's the whole entire teaching, just that? That was the whole teaching, yes. Bahia had spent years believing that liberation required some enormous, dramatic effort. More austerity, more suffering, more proof of devotion piled on top of more proof. And instead, it arrived through the smallest possible instruction, requiring nothing be added at all. If anything, it required the opposite of effort, a kind of subtraction. Stop adding. That's the whole of it. Why didn't anyone tell him that sooner? Surely someone could have saved him years of suffering. People likely did tell him in various forms throughout those years. But there's a particular kind of readiness that has nothing to do with how clearly a teaching is spoken, and everything to do with how exhausted a person finally becomes of their own old method. And Bahia had to fully exhaust the bark and austerity approach before a single sentence could land the way it did. You can hand someone the right teaching too early, and it simply bounces off the way water runs off a stone that hasn't yet been worn smooth enough to hold it. Bahia understood it completely, right there in the middle of the dusty road, surrounded by nothing more remarkable than ordinary dust and ordinary daylight. Not long afterward, he died, struck, as it happens, by a runaway cart, an almost startlingly ordinary, unremarkable kind of death for someone who had just touched something so significant. But he died already free because for whatever remained of that single day, he had finally learned how to hear a sound as simply a sound, nothing more added on top of it. Something in Ajahn Surya's tone shifted then, growing gentler, more direct, more clearly aimed at the boy lying beside him. That sound outside your window, Tenzin, the one that frightened you a few minutes ago, what exactly did your mind do with it in the very instant you first heard it? Tenzin thought back carefully. I thought, I'm not entirely sure. Something dragging, maybe. Or something coming closer, getting nearer to the window. You added a story onto it, Ajahn Surya said simply, without any judgment in his tone. The sound itself, in that instant, was just a sound, nothing more, nothing less. Your mind reached in immediately, almost before you had any say in the matter, and dressed that plain sound up in fear, the way every untrained mind tends to do, almost reflexively, often before a person even notices the dressing up happening at all. That's sati, bare attention, the practice of catching the mind in the very act of adding something extra, and just for the length of a single breath, gently letting that adding stop. And the other word? The longer one you mentioned earlier? Yoniso manasikara. Wise attention, not simply noticing something is happening, though that matters too, but noticing in a particular way that asks the right kind of question of the moment. Not what is this frightening sound, and how quickly can I escape from it, but instead, far more simply, what is actually here, right now, before any story has had the chance to arrive and explain it to me. Notice, just for a moment, what your own ears happen to be doing right now, listening to all of this. Not the meaning carried inside the words themselves, just the plain sound of them, moving through the air, the particular texture of it, the rhythm rising and falling, almost like breath. There is nothing else required of you in this exact instant. Just this. Try it with something else if you'd like, Ajahn Surya offered. Not the well rope this time, something in your own body. Is there an ache anywhere right now? My shoulders a little, from lying tense for so long. Good. Now, is the ache itself actually painful, or is it simply present? Check carefully before you answer. Most people answer too quickly. Tenzin checked. It's just there, I think. Not really painful. I think I decided it was uncomfortable before I'd actually looked at it closely. That's the whole practice in miniature. And sati catches the moment before the deciding happens. The ache was never the problem tonight. The story about the ache, that it shouldn't be there, that it means something's wrong, that it will get worse if ignored. That's what kept it occupying so much space in your attention. The ache itself, looked at directly, is usually small enough to simply sit alongside, the way you'd sit alongside a quiet stranger on a long journey, without needing them to leave the room. Does this work for thoughts too, the way it works for sounds and aches, or only for the body? It works for thoughts the same way, though thoughts are considerably more persuasive than a creaking rope, which is what makes them harder to catch in the act. A thought arrives already wearing the costume of urgent truth, not insisting it needs to be solved immediately, rather than simply noticed. The practice is the same regardless, just the thought, nothing added. Not this thought proved something is wrong with me. Simply a thought arrived. Most thoughts, looked at that plainly, turn out to be considerably less load-bearing than they first appeared. They were only ever borrowing their weight from the story wrapped around them. And Tenzin felt something loosen gently behind his own eyes. Not sleep exactly, not yet, but something closely adjacent to it. Something noticeably softer than the rigid, watchful alertness he had been carrying with him all night long, every minute since the moment he'd first lain down. Now, Ajahn Surya said, beginning to shift slightly, as though finally ready to rise and address the mysterious sound directly, once and for all. About that, he stopped himself mid-motion. No, he said instead, settling back down comfortably against the wall. Not yet, after all. There's a woman whose story genuinely needs to come first, before the sound. You'll understand exactly why, I think, once you've heard it all the way through to the end. Chapter 6. The mother and the mustard seed. The fire had gone down to embers now, a faint orange thread scattered through a wide bed of gray ash, and neither of them moved to feed it again. Somehow the cold no longer seemed to matter quite as much as it had a few hours earlier. No, when Tenzin had first noticed it creeping in through the gaps in the stone. Whether his body had simply adjusted, or whether something else in him had loosened enough to stop minding, he couldn't have said. Name was Kisa Gotami. Ajahn Surya began, his voice quieter now than it had been all night, carrying the particular gentleness people reserve for stories that still ache somehow, even after more centuries than anyone could properly count. She had a son, her only child, dearly loved in the way only children sometimes are, with a kind of single, concentrated devotion that has nowhere else to go. And one day, with absolutely no warning at all, the kind of warning a parent might at least have time to brace against, the boy died. Tenzin felt his own chest tighten in anticipation of where this particular story was clearly heading. Grief like that doesn't always look the way people expect grief to look. Ajahn Surya continued. Sometimes it doesn't look like sadness at all, not in any recognizable form. Sometimes it looks instead like a denial so complete, so total, that it becomes its own distinct kind of madness. Kisa Gotami simply refused to believe that her son was truly gone. She carried his small body from house to house throughout the village and then beyond the village, begging anyone she encountered along the way for medicine that might somehow revive him. People tried gently at first and then with growing concern to tell her the plain truth of what had happened. She wouldn't hear any of it, and grief had closed every single door in her mind except for one, the stubborn belief that somewhere, somehow, if she only still be undone. What happened to her in the end? Eventually, someone exhausted, perhaps, by their own complete inability to help her see reason, or perhaps simply out of compassion for how lost she clearly was, suggested that she go directly to the Buddha. Surely, of anyone, he would have medicine powerful enough to help. She went to him immediately, without hesitation, still carrying her son's body, and made her request exactly as she had made it to everyone else. Did he turn her away, the way everyone else apparently had? No, and this is the part of the story that tends to surprise people, the part most retellings rush past too quickly. He told her, quite simply, that he could in fact help her, that she should go and bring back a single mustard seed. An entirely ordinary thing found readily in nearly every household in the region. But there was one specific condition attached. The seed had to come from a household that had never once experienced death within its walls. No parent who had lost a child, no family who had lost anyone at all ever in their entire history. None felt something shift uneasily in his stomach, already beginning to sense what was coming, even before the story arrived there fully. She went immediately, full of fresh hope and ire, entirely certain this particular task would prove simple enough. The very first house she visited did indeed have mustard seeds readily on hand, but the mother living there told her, quietly, almost apologetically, that she had lost her own daughter just the year before. So Kisa Gotami moved on to the next house and then the next. Did she keep believing the whole time that she'd eventually find the right house? Or did she start to understand sooner than that? The old accounts suggest it took the better part of the day before the pattern fully settled into her. Early on, each refusal seemed like simple bad luck, nothing more. Surely the next house, or the one after that, would finally be free of loss. By midday, she'd have heard perhaps 20 such stories, each one delivered gently, none of them unkind, all of them the same in their essential shape: a husband gone, a parent gone, a child, a sibling. And It's worth imagining what that accumulation actually does to a grieving mind over the course of an afternoon. Not a single dramatic realization, but a slow, repeated knocking, house after house, each one chipping a little further at the wall she'd built around the belief that her loss was somehow singular. By evening, when she finally stopped searching, it wasn't because she'd given up. None. It was because the evidence had simply become impossible to keep arguing against. Each home, without exception, had mustard seeds in plentiful supply, and each home, without a single exception across the entire village and beyond it, had also known loss of some kind. A husband, taken too soon. A parent, gone before they should have been. A child. A sibling. By the end of that long day, she had visited more houses than she could properly count anymore, and not one of them, not a single one, was free of the very thing she had been so desperately trying to outrun. This is not a story about a woman who simply got over her grief, Ajahn Surya said quietly, each phrase given its own careful weight. This is not a story about forgetting her son, or about being somehow fixed. None. Healed on some neat, predictable schedule that other people might find convenient. This is a story about a mind finally coming to understand something it had been refusing, with everything it had, to see clearly. That her loss, however genuinely unbearable it remained, was not some special exception carved out uniquely for her alone. It was, instead, the oldest and most ordinary rule governing what it actually means to be alive at all. Everyone who has ever loved anyone has stood, eventually, somewhere near the edge of losing them. There has never been a single exception to that rule. Not for kings, not for mothers, not for anyone at all who has ever lived. Tenzin lay very still, feeling the considerable weight of that statement settle somewhere deep in his own chest. Not comforting, exactly, not in any immediate sense, but not entirely crushing either. Something steadier than either of those two extremes, occupying a quieter space somewhere in between. What did she do once she finally understood all of this? She returned to the Buddha without the seed. Of course, there had never been a single house anywhere that could have provided it, and by the end of her search, she understood that completely. And rather than feeling more isolated in her grief because of this failure, she felt, for the very first time since her son's death, considerably less alone in it than she had before. Everyone, it turned out, carried something resembling this same weight. She wasn't uniquely cursed among all people, set apart by some cruel exception to ordinary life. She was simply fully, unbearably human, exactly the same as everyone else who has ever grieved anything at all, in any village, in any era. In time, she went on to become a nun herself, and eventually, by most surviving accounts, found a depth of genuine peace that very few people across any era ever managed to reach. Dosa, Ajahn Surya added, after letting a silence stretch comfortably between them for a moment. Aversion. The mind's automatic, almost reflexive instinct to push something away the instant it feels unbearable. To treat pain as some kind of unwelcome intruder that simply shouldn't be allowed to exist in the first place. And karuna, compassion, which doesn't erase pain, doesn't make it disappear or pretend it was never there, but instead holds it differently, more gently, with considerably less resistance than aversion ever allows. Kisa Gotami's pain didn't disappear that particular day, not even slightly. But her aversion toward it did, just slightly, just enough. And that one small shift changed nearly everything that followed afterward, in ways she likely couldn't have predicted in that exact moment. What happened to the nun who'd told her about the seeds? The very first house? Do the accounts say anything more about her? Not directly, no, though I've always found myself curious about her too, the same as you seem to be. Whoever she was, she could easily have lied, just slightly, just to spare a clearly suffering stranger one more disappointment that particular day. She didn't. She told the plain truth, gently but without softening it into something false, and in doing so, known became the very first thread in the pattern Kisa Gotami eventually had to recognize for herself. I think there's a quiet lesson in that too, easy to miss beside the larger story. Sometimes the most compassionate thing available to offer someone in pain isn't comfort, exactly. It's simply honesty, delivered without cruelty, none. Trusting that the person in front of you can eventually do something useful with the truth, even if it doesn't feel kind in the immediate moment of hearing it. What was Kisa Gotami's life like afterward, once she'd become a nun? Did she find anything resembling happiness again, or only a kind of peace separate from happiness? Both, by most accounts, though they apparently arrived in a different order than people often expect. The peace came first, somewhat unexpectedly quickly, once she genuinely accepted what the mustard seed search had shown her. The happiness, the ordinary kind involving laughter and small daily pleasures, took considerably longer to return. When it did return, it apparently arrived in a noticeably different shape than before. Quieter, less attached to any single source, spread more evenly across many small things, rather than concentrated entirely in one beloved child the way it once had been. She became known later in her life for a particular gentleness with other grieving mothers, specifically nun. Women who arrived at the monastery in states not unlike her own earlier madness. And she reportedly never once told them to simply move past their grief or compared their loss unfavorably to anyone else's. None. She would simply sit with them the way the Buddha had once sat with her, until they were ready to discover whatever truth was waiting for them in their own particular version of the mustard seed search. Do you think every grief has its own version of that search? Even griefs that have nothing to do with mustard seeds, or even with death exactly. I've come to believe so, yes. The more years I spend sitting with people in exactly the kind of trouble you're in tonight, the shape changes considerably from person to person. Sometimes it's a literal search like hers. Sometimes it's simply the slow accumulation of evidence, gathered over months or years, that whatever feels like a uniquely cruel exception in your own life is actually, once you finally look around carefully enough, considerably more universal than your grief initially wanted you to believe. The universality doesn't make the pain smaller, exactly, but it does something almost as valuable. It removes the second layer of suffering that comes from believing yourself singled out, cursed in some particular way no one else has ever quite experienced. That removal alone, even without the original pain disappearing, tends to make the whole thing considerably more bearable. A soft, dragging creak sounded again outside the window, the very same sound from earlier in the night. This time, Tenzin noticed. His body didn't flinch nearly as hard as it had before. "There," Ajahn Surya said, something close to a smile in his voice now. "You heard it again, and it frightened you considerably less than the first time. Would you like to finally know what it actually is?" Tenzin nodded, genuinely curious now rather than afraid. "It's the old well rope," the monk said simply, without any drama in the reveal. "Out by the courtyard, past the kitchen. The wind catches against the iron hook some nights, particularly when it shifts direction the way it has tonight, and it drags and creaks, exactly like what you've been hearing. It's been doing precisely that for as long as I myself have lived in this place, which is considerably longer than you might guess. There's no monster waiting outside your window, Tenzin. There never was, not for one single moment tonight. Just an old rope and some ordinary wind and a mind that happens to be very, very good at inventing monsters out of almost nothing at all." Tenzin laughed then, a small, genuinely surprised laugh, the very first sound of real lightness he had managed all night. "All that fear," he said, shaking his head slightly, "over nothing more than a rope. All that fear," Ajahn Surya agreed, nodding, "is usually generated over something just as small as that, once you finally take the trouble to look directly at it instead of away from it. That's moha, delusion, which isn't really the same thing as stupidity, despite how it sometimes gets unfairly translated. It's simply confusion. Nothing more dramatic than that, mistaking a passing shadow for the substantial thing it merely resembles. He was quiet for a moment afterward, and, watching Tenzin's face carefully in the dim, fading light, something noticeably more open in it now than there had been even an hour earlier, before all these stories had begun unfolding one after another. "And does that happen to you too?" Tenzin asked. "Inventing monsters out of almost nothing? More often than I'd like to admit, even now after all these years. The shapes change as you get older, fewer well ropes, more worries about whether I've taught you all well enough, whether some decision I made decades ago set someone on a worse path than they'd otherwise have walked. But the basic mechanism doesn't retire just because you've worn the robes a long time. Moha doesn't check anyone's seniority before it shows up. The only real difference now is that I recognize the shape faster than I once did. I hear the creak, so to speak, and I'm quicker to ask what it actually is before I let it become a monster in my head. That's not the absence of delusion, it's simply a shorter leash on it. Since you're finally laughing," he said, "I think it's safe enough now to ask you something a little more difficult than anything we've covered so far tonight. What is it? Why I never married? You've been wondering about that for 2 nights running now, possibly longer. I've noticed you noticing." Chapter 7, Patakara's Feet. Ajahn Surya didn't answer Tenzin's question directly, not at first. He rarely did. Tenzin had noticed this particular pattern developing over the course of the night, the way the old monk consistently circled toward any answer about his own life through the much longer route of someone else's life entirely, as though his own story needed considerable preparation before it could be approached head-on. So instead, once again, he told Tenzin about a woman instead. "Her name was Patakara," he began. "And before I tell you what happened to her, I should warn you honestly, this isn't an easy story to sit through, not by any measure. But it's an important one, genuinely important, and I think tonight, of all the nights you might have heard it, you're finally ready for it." Tenzin nodded, pulling the blanket a little closer around himself. Though not, this time, out of any lingering fear. She married against her family's express wishes, purely for love, and went to live with her new husband in a distant village, far from everyone she had grown up knowing. In time, the two of them had 2 sons together. Her life, known by most reasonable measures available to judge such things, was a genuinely happy one. Modest in its material comforts, perhaps, but full in every way that actually mattered to her. What was she like before everything happened? Do the old accounts say much about that? Mostly small, ordinary details: that she was clever as a girl, headstrong enough to defy her parents' choice of a more suitable match in favor of a servant in her father's household she'd fallen for instead, which was itself considered a minor scandal at the time. She wasn't presented as someone unusually pious or unusually wise or marked out in any way as destined for what came later. That's worth holding on to, I think. She was simply an ordinary woman who loved her husband and her children the ordinary amount that any of us might love the people closest to us. Which is to say, completely, without reservation, the way you'd expect anyone to love what they'd built a life around. Nothing about her early story prepares you for what was coming. It isn't supposed to. Loss like hers never announces itself in advance to anyone. And then, within the span of only a few terrible days, every single bit of it was taken from her, one piece after another. "What happened?" Tenzin asked quietly, already dreading the answer even before it arrived. "Her husband died first from a snake bite suffered during an ordinary journey he had taken many times before without incident. Soon afterward, while attempting to cross a flooded river together with her 2 young sons, she lost first one boy to the swift current and then, moments later, while desperately trying to save him, lost the second boy as well, swept away in almost the same breath. And when she finally made her way back toward her family's home, broken in every sense a person can be broken, she learned upon arriving that her parents and her brother had all died together as well the very night before, killed in a sudden storm that had struck while she was still traveling. Everything, Tenzin whispered, the word barely audible, all of it at once, with no time at all in between. Ajahn Surya confirmed quietly, Empress, into a span of days. More loss than most people ever experience across an entire lifetime, delivered to her altogether, with no warning and no mercy in the timing. And it broke her completely, not as a figure of speech, not metaphorically in any sense. Completely. She lost her mind entirely afterward, wandering half-clothed across the open countryside for an unknown length of time, speaking coherently to no one, recognized by almost no one who happened to see her passing, lost somewhere far beyond what anyone would normally call ordinary grief. How does a person ever come back from somewhere that far gone? By something close to accident in her particular case. Doesn't that frighten you, though, Tenzin asked, that it took an accident? What if she'd wandered the other direction that day? Away from where the Buddha happened to be teaching. It's a fair fear to have, and I won't pretend the old texts answer it cleanly. But I'd offer this. She didn't wander aimlessly forever by pure chance alone. Something in her, even at the absolute bottom of that grief, kept moving rather than stopping entirely, kept her body alive and walking rather than letting it simply give out. Call that instinct, or call it some quieter thread of will that grief never fully extinguished. Whatever you call it, it carried her to a place where help happened to be available. I don't think it's only luck. I think it's closer to this. A person doesn't have to know where they're going in order to keep moving, and sometimes simply continuing to move, even blindly, even half out of one's mind, is enough to eventually arrive somewhere usable. And wandering without any real direction or intention, she eventually found herself, quite by chance, in a place where the Buddha happened to be teaching that day. People gathered nearby, seeing the state she was in, tried at first to keep her away from him, frightened by how clearly unwell she appeared. But the Buddha told them calmly to let her approach. What did he say to her once she was close enough to hear? Nothing at all. Not at first. He simply told her, very gently, to compose herself, and somehow, remarkably in his particular presence, something in her did settle, just slightly, just barely enough to matter. And then, as she stood there, still trembling, a servant nearby happened to be washing someone's feet, pouring water slowly over them in the customary way. Padakara watched that water fall, almost without meaning to watch it at all, some of it sinking immediately into the dry earth below, disappearing at once, while some of it pooled for a moment longer before it, too, eventually vanished, and some traveled a little further still before being absorbed completely, gone the same as all the rest. What did she see in that water that changed anything for her? Everything, as it turned out, Ajahn Surya said simply, and she saw her own entire life reflected directly in it, her husband, her 2 sons, her parents, her brother, each of them resembling a single drop of water, traveling some different distance before eventually vanishing, but vanishing all the same in the end, exactly like every other drop, exactly like every single person who has ever lived in the whole history of the world. None of them had been singled out for special cruelty. None of them had been cursed in some unique way that set her family apart from anyone else's. They had simply done, each of them, exactly what water does, what every living thing eventually does, sooner rather than later, returned quietly to the ground they had originally come from. This is not a story about a woman who simply got over her grief, Ajahn Surya said again, more slowly this time, as though the repetition itself carried its own particular weight worth preserving. This is not a story about forgetting what she had lost. This is not a story about being fixed, as though grief were nothing more than some mechanical flaw waiting patiently to be repaired by the right tool. This is a story, finally, about a mind learning after everything, not to let one single moment simply be one single moment, not the entire accumulated sum of every loss that had come crashing down before it, and not some grim forecast of every loss still somehow waiting ahead. Just this one moment, watching water fall. In that single instant, he continued, Something in her settled completely, all at once, into a way that years of wandering grief had never once managed to accomplish on its own. And the Buddha spoke a short teaching to her immediately afterward, concerning impermanence, touching absolutely everything without a single exception anywhere, and she understood it the same way Bahia had once understood his own teaching out on the open road, completely, immediately, with her entire being, not merely with her mind. She became a nun not long afterward, and in time, one of the most deeply respected teachers among all of the Buddha's female disciples, known specifically for her gift in helping other grieving women find their own way back. Kanti, Tenzin said softly, the word surfacing from somewhere earlier in the night. Patience, you said before? Patience. Yes, though not the kind of patience most people typically mean by that word, gritting their teeth grimly through something they find unbearable until it finally passes. A considerably deeper kind than that. Patience required to let an entire wave finish moving all the way through you, in its own time, without rushing it artificially toward some premature conclusion, without fighting it every step of the way, without demanding that it resolve faster than it's actually able to resolve on its own terms. And anatta, not self, the understanding, however difficult to fully absorb, that the people we love most dearly, even the ones we love beyond all reasonable measure, were never truly ours to keep in any permanent sense to begin with. They were only ever passing through, exactly the way water passes briefly over bare feet before continuing on, exactly the way one season eventually passes into the next, regardless of how badly anyone might wish to hold it in place. That sounds almost like it would make loving anyone feel pointless, if nothing's ever really yours to keep. I understand why it might land that way at first, but I think it's closer to the opposite if you sit with it longer. Knowing water will pass over your feet doesn't make the water less worth feeling while it's there. If anything, it's the assumption of permanence that makes loss feel like betrayal when it inevitably arrives, as though life broke some promise it never actually made. Padakara's unraveling came partly from believing, without ever consciously deciding to believe it, that her husband and her sons were simply hers, settled, permanent fixtures rather than passing presences she'd been given for a time. The teaching doesn't ask you to love less. It asks you to love without the hidden contract that this isn't supposed to end. Most of the suffering sits in the contract, not in the love itself. The room had gone very quiet by now. Tenzin lay still, feeling something stirring in his own chest that he didn't yet have adequate words to properly describe. Not happiness exactly, and not sadness either, but something steadier underneath both of those more familiar feelings, occupying its own quieter territory. Did she ever speak about her sons again afterward, or her husband? Once she'd become a nun, by most accounts, yes. No. Differently than before. Not avoiding the memory the way some people do with grief too large to look at directly, but also not drowning in it the way she once had, wandering half-clothed through the countryside, lost entirely inside it. She apparently spoke of them sometimes to the women she later taught, particularly to other mothers who had lost children of their own, using her own loss not as a badge of unique suffering but as a bridge toward theirs. There's something worth noticing in that shift. Before her transformation, her grief had isolated her completely and convinced her that no one else could possibly understand what she carried. Afterward, the very same grief became the thing that let her reach other grieving women more effectively than almost anyone else could have. The wound didn't disappear. It simply stopped being only a wound and became, eventually, a kind of bridge as well. Did she ever meet Kisa Gotami? None. It seems like they would have understood each other better than almost anyone else alive. There are accounts suggesting they did, in fact, eventually become close, teaching alongside one another for a time within the same community of nuns. Each one apparently recognizing in the other a particular depth of understanding that even their most devoted students couldn't quite reach, however genuinely those students tried. I find something quietly moving in that image when I let myself sit with it. Two women, each having lost nearly everything imaginable to grief and to a kind of temporary madness that grief had produced in them, sitting together afterward not as broken people comparing wounds, but as two of the most respected teachers within their entire community, their past devastation now simply one part of a much larger life rather than the entire shape of it. I think that's worth holding on to on a night like tonight, when your own troubles likely feel, to you, considerably larger and more permanent than I suspect they'll actually turn out to be. Do you think that's true for everyone, Aunt? That whatever feels enormous tonight will eventually become just one part of a larger life rather than the entire shape of it? I haven't met an exception yet, though I won't pretend the shrinking happens quickly or painlessly or on any predictable schedule. Some fears take years to settle into their proper proportion, but I've watched it happen often enough across enough different lives, including my own. I trust the pattern more than I trust the present moment's insistence that this particular fire will burn forever at exactly its current size. Tenzin thought of his own fear, the one he'd finally spoken aloud 3 chapters ago, failing, shaming his family, being the reason it all fell apart. It still sat somewhere in his chest, real and present, but it no longer filled the entire room the way it had 3 nights ago. Something about hearing it placed alongside Padakara's flooded river, Kisa Gotami's mustard seed, Angulimala's garland of fingers, had quietly shifted its proportions without erasing it entirely. That still doesn't actually answer my question, he said finally, his voice careful, gentle. Why you never married all those years ago? Ajahn Surya looked toward the door for a long, extended moment, as though listening carefully for something far away that Tenzin himself couldn't begin to hear. Not tonight, he said quietly, after the silence had stretched on considerably. Soon, I promise you. But there's a man I have to tell you about first before we get there. A man considerably more frightening on the surface at least, any sleepless king or any desperate, suffering ascetic you've heard about so far tonight. A man who once collected fingers, quite literally, from the people he killed along the road. Known Chapter 8. The killer, who learned to sit through the dark Tenzin, had stopped watching the door by now, and stopped watching the window too, and stopped watching the shadows gathered in the corners of the room. Somewhere, over the course of the last hour or so, without quite noticing exactly when the shift had happened, he had started watching the old monk's face instead, carefully, a way it shifted almost imperceptibly with each new story, as though every single one of them cost Ajahn Surya something small and real to tell, some private toll paid out with each retelling. His name, before everything about him changed completely, was Ahimsaka. Ajahn Surya began, which means almost unbearably given everything that followed, the harmless one. But the world, as it turns out, rarely allows a name like that to remain accurate for very long, no matter how well-intentioned the parents who chose it. Through a long series of betrayals and careful manipulations carried out by a teacher he had trusted completely, without reservation, he was eventually convinced that the only way to properly complete his spiritual training was to kill exactly 1,000 people, and to take a single finger from each one of them, wearing the collection afterward as a grim, undeniable kind of proof that the task had genuinely been completed. Tenzin's stomach turned uncomfortably at the description. He actually went through with it, all of it. He came devastatingly close to completing it in full. Village after village fell into frightened silence at the mere mention of his name, long before he ever arrived anywhere near them, and people began calling him Angulimala, garland of fingers, and went to considerable lengths to avoid entire roads rather than risk crossing his path even once. Did anyone ever try to stop him before the Buddha did? Soldiers, or villagers banding together. Several attempts, by most accounts, all of them failed, and badly. He was reportedly skilled enough and desperate enough by that point. That organized resistance only seemed to confirm for him that he was already too far gone to turn back. That's worth sitting with for a moment, because it's a pattern that shows up well beyond this one extreme story. Shame and fear, no. Once a person believes themselves beyond redemption, tend to accelerate the very behavior everyone's hoping to stop rather than halt it. The village's terror, however justified, likely made it harder, not easier, for him to imagine any other ending to his own story besides the one he'd already started writing. He had become, by every honest account available, and exactly the kind of monster Kisa Gotami had once imagined waiting somewhere outside her own door in her grief. Except this particular monster was entirely real and actively walking and drawing steadily closer to his 1,000th intended victim with every single day that passed. How does anyone like that ever manage to stop once they've gone that far down such a road? The Buddha walked, quite deliberately and with full awareness of the risk, directly down the very road where Angulimala was known to be actively hunting that particular day. People along the way warned him urgently not to go anywhere near it, begged him, in fact, with real desperation in their voices. He went anyway, entirely alone, completely unarmed, and remarkably calm throughout. When Angulimala caught sight of him and began running him down with clear intent to make him the 1,000th and final victim, something genuinely strange happened. No matter how fast Angulimala ran, pushing himself to his absolute physical limit, he simply couldn't manage to close the distance between them, even though the Buddha, by every outward appearance, was doing nothing more than walking along at an entirely ordinary, unhurried pace. How is that even possible? The old texts leave that particular detail deliberately mysterious, and perhaps it's genuinely better left that way, open to whatever interpretation serves the listener best. What matters far more is what happened immediately afterward. Angulimala, furious by now and thoroughly exhausted from the futile chase, finally shouted for the Buddha to stop running from him, and the Buddha answered, with complete calm, that he had in fact stopped long ago. It was Angulimala himself who hadn't yet managed to stop, hadn't stopped causing harm, hadn't stopped running from his own deepest self, hadn't stopped mistaking raw violence for genuine power. Tenzin felt something shift noticeably in the weight of the story as it unfolded, less like simple horror now, and more like the held breath that comes just before some significant turn. Something in that particular answer finally broke through, after everything else in his entire life had failed to reach him. Angulimala fell to his knees right there in the middle of the road and asked with complete sincerity to be ordained on the spot. And the Buddha, to the genuine horror of nearly everyone who later heard about what had happened, accepted him without hesitation. People must have been absolutely furious when they found out. Terrified, mostly, even more than furious. And Angulimala himself was far from finding any immediate peace despite the ordination. Becoming a monk didn't erase what he had done, nor did it erase the nights that inevitably followed afterward. In fact, this is precisely the part of the story that most retellings tend to leave out entirely, skipping straight from the dramatic conversion to some implied peaceful ending. His first several months wearing the robes were nights of genuine pure terror. He was entirely convinced, lying alone in the dark, that the grieving families of those he had killed would eventually find him while he slept. That some deserved vengeance, owed to them 1,000 times over, was steadily coming for him, and that he likely wouldn't see it arrive before it finally did. Did the other monks know what he'd been when he first arrived among them? Most of them, yes, eventually. It would have been difficult to keep something that widely known entirely secret. By most accounts, some kept a careful distance from him at first, and understandably enough, while others, perhaps sensing how much that distance would cost him at exactly the wrong moment, made a point of sitting near him anyway, treating him the same as any other new arrival. I think that ordinary kindness offered by people who had every reason to withhold it did almost as much for him in those early months as any teaching could have. Fear isolates a person further the longer it's left entirely alone with itself. A few monks willing to simply sit nearby without demanding he prove his transformation first gave that fear slightly less room to convince him he deserved nothing but isolation. What did he actually do faced with that kind of fear night after night? He learned slowly and with considerable agony to sit through that fear directly rather than running from it, which turned out to be, in its own particular way, the single hardest practice of his entire life, more difficult by far than anything that had come before it, easier, in some genuine sense, to commit violence outward than to simply sit still, completely alone, with the full unbearable weight of everything he had done, and not look away from any part of it. But he did exactly that, night after night, for longer than he might have predicted he could endure. And in time, that fear which had once felt certain to consume him entirely, simply began, very gradually, to wear itself down, not because the past itself changed in any way. It never does for anyone, but because he finally stopped feeding it with more running. If you have ever lain awake yourself, certain that some consequence is steadily coming for you somewhere out of the dark, some old mistake you can't undo, some fear about exactly who you've been or what you've done, you are likely not nearly as far from Angulimala's own first terrified nights as it might initially seem from the outside. The particular fear that visits reliably at 3 in the morning rarely arrives carrying anything genuinely new to say. It mostly just repeats what it has always said. And the moment you stop running from that repetition, even slightly, even just once, it begins, slowly but surely, to lose its grip on you. Did he ever tell anyone what those first nights were actually like? Tenzin asked. Or did he just carry it alone? Ed. There's a verse attributed to him later in his life where he describes it plainly enough. Lying in some forest dwelling, hearing every snapped branch outside as a vengeful relative finally arriving, every gust of wind as the start of his deserved end, he doesn't dress it up as anything noble. He simply says it was terrifying night after night for longer than he'd have liked to admit on. What changed wasn't the fear arriving less often. It was that he stopped treating its arrival as proof he deserved to be destroyed by it. Fear, even fully justified fear, doesn't actually require that the feared thing happen. It only requires that you survive sitting with it once more than you expected to. Metta, Ajahn Surya said. Loving kindness, which he eventually learned with considerable difficulty to extend not only outward toward others, but inward toward himself as well, which is almost always the considerably harder direction for anyone to manage. And moha, delusion, the very same confusion that once made you fear nothing more than an old well rope, scaled up here to its most extreme possible form. A man who had once badly mistaken violence for genuine strength, and badly mistaken fear itself for some enemy that could never be faced directly, only ever fled from. And did he ever actually find real peace in the end? In time, yes, genuinely by most surviving accounts. He became known eventually for his particular gift in tending to women experiencing difficult childbirth, offering a specific blessing rooted directly in his own remarkable transformation. Proof, perhaps, that even someone who has done the very worst things imaginable can still turn, fully and completely, towards something considerably gentler, given enough nights spent simply sitting through the dark instead of running endlessly from it. Did the villagers ever stop being afraid of him, even after he'd changed? Some did. Eventually, particularly those who witnessed firsthand the gentleness he'd grown into. Others, by most honest accounts, never fully managed it. Old fear doesn't always update itself just because the facts have changed. There were almost certainly people who avoided him for the rest of his life, regardless of who he'd become. I think that's an important detail to include rather than smooth over. His transformation was real, and his peace was real, but it didn't erase the fear he'd planted in people who had every reasonable right to keep carrying it. Redemption in the old stories as in ordinary life rarely comes with everyone else's forgiveness attached automatically. Sometimes a person has to find their own peace with what they've done, while accepting that not everyone around them will ever fully extend the same peace back. What did the blessing actually say? Do you know it? Roughly, yes, he would tell suffering mothers, with complete sincerity, that since the day of his ordination he had never intentionally taken a life. May that truth bring her and her child ease and safety. There's something quietly extraordinary in that particular wording if you sit with it. He didn't pretend his past had never happened, didn't ask anyone to forget the garland of fingers or the terror he'd once caused across an entire region. He simply spoke the truth of who he had become since that turning point and let that truth, freely and honestly offered, be what helped someone else in a moment of real danger. I think that's worth remembering on your own difficult nights, Tenzin. Whatever shape they eventually take in your own life, you're never required to erase what came before in order to offer something genuinely good now. You're only ever asked to speak honestly about who you've actually become, and let that speak for itself. Did he ever change his name, An? Or did he keep being called Angulimala even after everything? By most accounts, he kept the name, which I've always found notable in itself. He could easily have requested a new one upon ordination, the way some monks do, and shedding the old identity along with the old life. He apparently chose not to, perhaps understanding something the rest of us are slower to learn, that running from a name doesn't actually undo what the name represents, any more than running from a memory undoes the memory itself. Keeping it meant that everywhere he went, for the rest of his life, someone might recognize who he'd once been before they recognized who he'd since become. That's a considerably harder path than simply disappearing into a fresh identity and hoping no one ever connects the two. But it also meant his transformation, when people eventually witnessed it directly, carried a weight that a stranger's calm could never quite match. They weren't watching an ordinary monk practice ordinary kindness. They were watching the exact man they'd once feared most, choosing, deliberately and repeatedly, to be someone entirely different now. Tenzin thought of his own name, of how little, in the end, it had to do with anything he'd actually feared tonight. No one was asking him to outrun some past mistake the way Angulimala had, just to sit through one ordinary sleepless night without deciding it meant more than it did. The fire had gone down to almost nothing at all by now, just the faintest red glow buried somewhere deep within the ash. Ajahn Surya looked at it for a long, quiet moment before speaking again. Even he learned eventually to sleep peacefully, he said softly. It cost him nearly everything else first before he ever got there. Chapter 9. Yasodhara's lamp. Tenzin had almost forgotten his own earlier question by now, the one about marriage, about whatever it was Ajahn Surya had been carefully circling around all night without ever quite landing on it directly. But the old monk clearly hadn't forgotten at all. Tenzin could somehow tell, the particular way the room had settled, that this next story was finally going to carry them all the way there. There was a woman, Ajahn Surya began, named Yasodhara, and before the Buddha was ever known as the Buddha, long before any of what you currently know him for had happened to him or through him, he was simply a young prince, married to her in the ordinary way princes were married in those days. They had a son together in time, and by every honest account available, theirs was a marriage built genuinely on real affection between them, not merely on careful arrangement between two families. What was he like before he left? The prince, I mean. Restless by most accounts, in a way his father tried very hard to manage by surrounding him with every possible comfort, hoping enough pleasure might smother whatever was stirring underneath it. It didn't work, of course. Comfort rarely cures restlessness. It mostly just delays the reckoning with it. He'd reportedly seen on a few rare excursions outside the palace walls his father couldn't quite prevent, an old man, a sick man, a corpse being carried to cremation, ordinary sights to nearly everyone else, but entirely new to him, sheltered as he'd been from all of it. Something about encountering aging, illness, and death for the first time as an adult, other than absorbing them gradually throughout childhood the way most people do, seems to have struck him with unusual force. Yasodhara, for her part, likely had no idea any of this was building toward what eventually happened. By every account, the departure came as a genuine shock to her, not the conclusion of some visible unraveling she'd been watching unfold. And then he simply left her, Tenzin said. I remember that part, vaguely, on from an earlier lesson. Yes. In the middle of the night, while both she and their son were sleeping peacefully, he walked quietly out of the palace and toward an entirely different life that neither of them could possibly have foreseen or prepared for in any way. He didn't say goodbye to her. He didn't offer any explanation she could hold on to afterward. He simply went, leaving her to wake the very next morning to an absence she would spend years afterward trying to properly understand. That seems genuinely cruel. However, it eventually turned out, Tenzin said, before he could quite stop himself from saying it. Many people across many generations have thought exactly that. Ajahn Surya agreed without any defensiveness. There's real truth contained in that particular reaction. Abandonment of any kind is rarely simple to process, no matter what someone eventually goes on to become as a direct result. But what's far less often told, most versions of this particular story, is what Yasodhara herself did with all the years that followed his departure. She didn't remain, for the rest of her life, only a woman who had been left behind. Slowly, and entirely on her own deliberate timeline, she began turning toward the very same kind of practice he himself had pursued, not because she was simply following along after him, trailing his footsteps, but because, in her own time, by her own entirely separate road, she eventually arrived at much the same clarity he had found. She didn't resent him after everything. I imagine she resented him considerably for a good long while at least. Grief and resentment tend to travel together for a time in nearly everyone who experiences real loss of any kind. Tenzin was quiet for a moment. My mother cried when I left, he said, the admission coming out smaller than he intended. She tried not to let me see, but I saw anyway. I haven't let myself think about that very much these last 3 nights. Of course you haven't, Ajahn Surya said gently. It's not an easy thing to hold, especially at this hour. But consider, your mother's tears and her support for you leaving aren't in conflict with each other, any more than Yasodhara's grief and her own later choice to ordain were in conflict. A person can grieve a departure and still believe, somewhere underneath the grief, that it was the right one. Yasodhara's years of waiting weren't years of regretting that he'd gone. They were years of metabolizing what his going had cost her, separately from whether it had been worth it. Your mother's tears are probably doing something similar right now, on the other side of this mountain, while you lie here worrying you've wounded her beyond repair. How do you know that's true? Not just something comforting to say. I don't know it with certainty. No, I wasn't there, and I can't see into your mother's heart any better than you can. But I've sat with enough departing novices over enough years, and enough of their parents when they visited afterward, to trust the pattern more than I distrust it. Grief at a goodbye and belief in the goodbye's rightness coexist far more often than fear tells us they do in the middle of the night. Do you think Yasodhara ever got to tell him any of that? That she understood eventually, even if it took years? There's a passage, much later, describing a visit she paid him after he'd returned, briefly to the region where she lived, not as a husband returning, but as a teacher passing through. She didn't approach him directly that first time. She'd simply stood among the crowd gathered to listen, the same as anyone else. Let her son go forward alone to be acknowledged. Only later, in her own time, on her own terms, did she approach him as herself. None. I find that detail more moving than almost anything else in the story. That she didn't need the reunion to happen on his schedule. She'd already done the harder work of understanding without him. Meeting him again was simply confirmation of something she no longer needed him to provide. Tenzin thought about that for a while, the image settling into him slowly. But eventually, by most surviving accounts, she ordained herself as well, choosing renunciation not as someone simply discarded or left behind, but as someone who had finally chosen entirely for herself the same deep stillness he had once walked toward alone all those years before. Not his particular path, mind you. Her own path, which simply happened in the end to lead towards something quite similar. What was she like in those later years once she'd ordained herself? And, by most accounts, formidable in her own quiet way, known for an unusual steadiness that younger nuns reportedly found both comforting and slightly intimidating. The particular calm of someone who had already survived the worst thing she could imagine happening to her and found, on the other side of it, that she was still entirely herself. And some accounts suggest she lived to a considerable age, long enough to see her own son grown and ordained as well, the family's entire trajectory eventually bending back toward the very thing that had once torn it apart. I find something quietly remarkable in that, beyond the obvious neatness of it as a story. It suggests that even a wound inflicted in the middle of the night, without warning or explanation, doesn't necessarily determine everything that follows. The years afterward are still genuinely yours to shape, regardless of how the initial wound arrived. Did she ever forgive him, do you think? Not just understand him, actually forgive him the way people mean when they say that word. I think the question itself might be slightly the wrong shape, if I'm honest, though I understand why it's the natural one to ask. And forgiveness, as most people use the word, implies a kind of verdict delivered from one person to another. I judge what you did, and I now release you from the consequence of that judgment. And what the old accounts suggest happened with Yasodhara feels different from that, gentler and stranger at once. She didn't seem to spend her later years deciding whether he deserved forgiveness. She seemed, instead, not to simply outgrow the question, the way a person outgrows clothes that no longer fit rather than deciding formally to retire them. Her own practice, her own path toward the same stillness he'd found, eventually made the entire framework of judgment and pardon feel beside the point. I don't know that this is a better way to arrive at peace than formal forgiveness, but it's the way the old stories suggest she arrived at it, and I find it worth offering you, since you're young enough still that you may need either path or both at different points in your own life. What happened to their son in the end? Did he ever resent his father, the way the village might have expected him to? By most accounts, no, though the relationship took its own particular shape, considerably different from an ordinary father raising a son in the conventional sense. Their son grew up largely without his father physically present, raised primarily by Yasodhara and the wider royal household, and only later, once he was old enough to choose for himself, sought ordination under his father's teaching, becoming a monk in his own right. There's an account of their very first formal teaching exchange, a father and son meeting now as teacher and student rather than as parent and child in any conventional sense, and by most descriptions it was notably tender, either one trying to reclaim the relationship they might have had under different circumstances, both simply meeting each other honestly in whatever relationship actually remained available to them. I think that's a particular kind of wisdom worth noting in itself, not insisting that a relationship be restored to its original shape, but allowing it to become something new and equally real, suited to who both people had actually become in the years between. Did Yasodhara mind that her son chose the same path his father had, after everything that path had cost her? There's no clear record of resentment on her part. Interestingly, though, I won't pretend to know her private heart with any certainty across all these centuries. What the accounts do suggest is that by the time her son made his choice, she had already walked far enough along her own version of the same path that she could recognize, in his choosing it, something other than simple repetition of the wound that had once been inflicted on her. Perhaps she saw it instead as her son finding, in his own time, by his own road, the same clarity she'd eventually found by hers. A choice that once would have looked to her younger self like abandonment repeating itself may have looked to her settled later self like something closer to inheritance. A faint light caught Tenzin's eye through the narrow window. The room had gone very quiet by now. Tenzin waited, sensing somehow that the old monk was finally circling toward his own long-withheld answer. "I left someone too once," Ajahn Surya said simply, without offering any further elaboration beyond that single plain sentence. She understood why, in the end, before I ever fully did myself. That's all I intend to say about it tonight, at least for now. It landed gently in the quiet room, without any real drama attached to it, no grand confession, no flood of further detail. Just one plain sentence, offered honestly and then set carefully down, the way you might set down something heavy you'd been carrying a long while. Tenzin didn't push for anything more. Something in the particular quiet way it had been spoken made it entirely clear that whatever remained unsaid wasn't being withheld out of evasion, but rather out of genuine care for how much any single night could reasonably be expected to hold. "Do you regret it, whatever it was?" Ajahn Surya considered the question with real care, the way he'd considered very little else all night. "Less than I once did, more than I'd like, depending on the year you happen to ask me. Regret isn't something that resolves cleanly and then stays resolved. It visits less often, and the way most fires eventually burn lower. But I won't tell you it disappeared entirely, because that wouldn't be honest, and I think you've earned honesty from me tonight after everything you've shared yourself." A faint light caught Tenzin's eye through the narrow window, small, steady, far off across the dark valley, resting somewhere along the distant ridge. He hadn't noticed it there before, not once all night. "What's that?" he asked, not pointing. "That light out there on the ridge." Ajahn Surya's eyes flicked toward it briefly, something unreadable passing quickly across his weathered face before disappearing again. "Not tonight," he said. "There's a man I need to tell you about first. A man who spent his whole life caring for other people's bodies and never learned, until far too late, how to properly care for his own. And you need to hear about him before you're ready to properly rest yourself." He shifted the conversation gently elsewhere after that, though Tenzin noticed, and would remember clearly later, that the old monk hadn't actually said no to the question, only not yet. If you've ever carried a long quiet waiting the way Yasodhara did for years on end, never entirely certain when or even whether any answer would eventually arrive, you'll likely understand something many people only discover deep in the middle of some long night. That waiting itself, given enough time, eventually changes its own basic shape. It stops being simply an ache to be endured and slowly becomes, instead, its own particular kind of quiet practice. Picture for just a moment a parent sitting up at 3 in the morning with a feverish child, hours and hours into a worry that has long since stopped being genuinely useful to anyone, the mind circling the exact same fears it already knows entirely by heart. Then, without any single dramatic moment ever marking the actual change, the worry simply runs out of fuel to burn. The shoulders finally drop. The breath at last evens out completely. Not because the fever itself broke on, simply because the worry, exactly like every fire that has ever burned, eventually exhausts whatever it had to burn through and goes quiet entirely on its own, in its own time. "You're tired," Ajahn Surya observed quietly, watching Tenzin's face carefully in the dim light. "A little," Tenzin admitted, "though not the same way I was tired before. Not the same kind of tired at all, somehow." "No," the old monk agreed, something gentle in his voice. "Not remotely the same kind of tired." Chapter 10. Jivaka's Hands. The cold had crept up slowly through the floor stones over the last hour or so, settling into the joints of anyone still sitting upright against it. Neither of them moved to do anything about it directly. There was something about the stillness of the room by this point in the night that made even ordinary discomfort feel oddly distant, easy enough to simply set aside without much real effort required. There's a man I haven't told you about yet, Ajahn Surya said, who never wandered the open roads as an ascetic the way Bahia did, never committed any great violent crime the way Angulimala once had, never lost everything he loved within a single terrible week the way Padakara did. His particular struggle was considerably quieter than any of those, and in some genuine ways more familiar to most ordinary people than any of tonight's other stories so far. Who was he then? Jivaka Nand, the royal physician of his era, trained extensively in the finest medical traditions available at the time, eventually responsible for treating the Buddha himself directly, along with much of the wider surrounding community of monks who depended on his care. He was, by every honest account that survives him, extraordinarily skilled at his work. People traveled considerable distances seeking his particular care, and he rarely, if ever, turned anyone away who genuinely needed him. That doesn't sound like much of a struggle on the surface of it. Not at first glance, no. But consider for a moment what that particular kind of life actually demanded of him. Day after day, year after year, every single hour of every single day belonged in some sense to somebody else's pain rather than to his own needs. He tended fevers deep in the middle of the night when everyone else was sleeping. He set broken bones at first light before most people had even woken. And he sat patiently with the dying long after everyone else present had quietly given up hope, simply because someone needed to remain there with them. And in all of that tireless, unceasing care extended toward other people's bodies, he rarely, if ever, attended properly to his own. Tenzin thought of his own exhaustion that night. Though it was nothing at all, he realized now, compared to carrying an entire community's accumulated suffering across two hands, year after year, without real rest. Did anyone ever care for him the way he so consistently cared for everyone else around him? Rarely, if ever. That's often the quiet and largely unspoken tragedy hidden inside people like Jivaka, so thoroughly practiced at recognizing exhaustion the instant they see it in someone else, and yet so completely blind to that same exhaustion sitting inside themselves. That sounds a little like you, Tenzin said before he'd quite decided whether it was appropriate to say. Sitting up with novices half the night. Who sits up with you? Ajahn Surya laughed quietly, a real laugh this time, brief but genuine. Caught again, fair enough, I have my own ways, smaller and less visible than this. An empty hour before dawn, mostly, when the rest of the monastery is still asleep and no one needs anything from me yet. No, it isn't dramatic, but it's mine, and I protect it more carefully than I let on. Even people who teach rest have to actually practice receiving it, or the teaching turns hollow soon enough. Here is what he eventually came to understand and teach, through his own slow, hard-won realization, that genuine rest never actually begins in the mind at all, despite what most people assume. It begins instead, the body itself. Long before any thoughts manage to properly settle, the body has to be given clear, explicit permission to release whatever it has been quietly holding on to, often for far longer than anyone realizes. And how does someone actually give their own body that kind of permission? Slowly, deliberately, one part at a time, almost the way you might patiently untie a stubborn knot, not by yanking at it forcefully all at once, but by gently loosening each small individual twist in its own proper turn. Ajahn Surya's voice had grown noticeably quieter now, considerably slower, and each individual word given a little more room to settle than the words that had come before it. Begin with the jaw, which holds far more tension throughout an ordinary day than most people ever realize. Clenched tight without anyone consciously noticing it happening. Let it simply hang slightly open now, entirely unclenched, completely unguarded. Then move to the shoulders next, which rise almost entirely on their own, the very instant any day makes some new demand of us, and which rarely come back down again afterward until something specific reminds them they're genuinely allowed to. Tenzin felt his own shoulders again, the same way he had earlier in the night, and let them drop a little further still this time, noticing the small release as it happened. Then the hands, Ajahn Surya continued, his pacing slower still now. which curl, more often than most people ever realize, into something resembling a fist even during the most ordinary, unremarkable moments, holding nothing at all, gripping at nothing in particular, and yet remaining closed regardless, not purely out of long habit. Let the fingers loosen now, one by one, if it helps. Let them rest open exactly the way they did once before the day ever asked anything at all of them. His voice had slowed further still, each individual sentence drawn out a little longer than the last, the deliberate pacing itself becoming part of the actual teaching now rather than something separate from it. And the forehead too, which holds a particular kind of tension most people never think to check, a slight furrow between the eyebrows that arrives sometime in childhood and rarely fully leaves afterward. Let it smooth out now, just slightly, the way water smooths when wind stops disturbing its surface, and the feet, all the way at the other end of you, which have been pointed and braced and ready to move for longer than you probably realize, even lying still. Let them simply fall open, heavy, done with bracing for tonight. Then the chest, which holds breath considerably higher and tighter than it ever actually needs to, especially toward the very end of a long day. And let the next breath travel a little lower than usual, down past where it normally stops, not forced there deliberately, simply allowed, settling naturally into the belly instead of remaining caught up high in the ribs the way it has been all night. And then the legs, heavy now, properly heavy, which have carried real weight all day without a single word of complaint, and have fully earned by now the simple right to finally stop. Tenzin noticed, almost without quite realizing it was happening, that his own body had begun following along with each instruction. Not because he was consciously trying to make it happen, but because the words themselves seemed to be doing something entirely independent of his own deliberate attention. "This is upekkha," Ajahn Surya said softly. "Equanimity, not the complete absence of feeling, as people sometimes mistakenly assume, but rather a kind of deep evenness that allows feeling to move freely through a person without triggering resistance. And samadhi, settled concentration, which doesn't require any real effort to maintain. Once the body itself has actually been allowed to properly rest, the mind, it turns out, follows the body's lead far more often than most people ever assume. It very rarely leads the way itself, despite how it might feel from the inside." He paused for a long, comfortable moment, the silence between them stretching out easily now. Later in his life, by most accounts, yes, though it apparently took him considerably longer than it took most of his own patients, which he was reportedly the first to admit, with some humor whenever anyone pointed out the irony. There's something almost comforting in that detail, I think. The man who taught half a kingdom how to rest properly took his own time getting there himself. And wisdom about rest and the actual practice of resting don't always arrive together, even in people who understand the principle perfectly well. No. You can know exactly how a string ought to be tuned and still spend years walking around with your own strung far too tight, simply because knowing and practicing are two entirely different muscles. What finally changed it? For him. Did something specific happen? Or did it just gradually shift, the way most things in tonight's story seem to? By most accounts, gradually, though there's one incident worth mentioning. He reportedly collapsed once. From sheer exhaustion in the middle of treating a particularly difficult case, falling asleep upright at a patient's bedside despite every intention to remain alert. He woke mortified, certain he'd failed both the patient and his own standards entirely. But the patient, recovering well despite the lapse, simply told him gently that perhaps a physician who never rested was no better suited to caring for the sick than one who never properly studied medicine in the first place. That exhaustion itself was a kind of incompetence he'd somehow exempted himself from noticing in his own case, even while diagnosing it instantly in everyone else's. He apparently took that observation more seriously than any teaching he'd received up to that point. Precisely because it came from someone he was supposed to be the one helping, rather than from someone positioned above him to instruct him. That seems almost backward. Usually it's the teacher correcting the student, not the other way around. Wisdom rarely respects that particular order as strictly as we'd like to imagine, Tenzin. Sometimes the clearest teaching of your life arrives from someone with considerably less formal standing than you, simply because they happen to be positioned to see something about you that your own training had made you blind to. I've learned more from certain frightened, sleepless novices over the years than from decades of formal study, if I'm entirely honest with you. You do well to stay open to that possibility yourself as you go on, rather than assuming wisdom only ever flows downward from those with more seniority. Has that already happened tonight? Have I taught you anything, the way those other novices did? Ajahn Surya considered the question seriously, rather than offering an automatic reassurance. I think so, yes. Though I'll need a few more nights of reflection to know exactly what shape it's taken. Your question earlier, about whether it bothers me when someone leaves after I've taught them, made me examine something I hadn't examined quite that directly in some time. And the question you just asked about whether wisdom only flows downward is itself a small piece of exactly the kind of teaching I mean. You're not simply absorbing tonight's stories passively. You're testing them, pushing back gently where something doesn't quite sit right, which is precisely the kind of engagement that makes a teaching actually useful rather than merely heard. There's a teaching, he added, almost as an aside, passed down from monks living in mountains even colder than these ones, and higher up, further from anywhere. They speak of falling asleep without entirely losing awareness in the process, letting the body release completely into genuine rest while some small, quiet thread of attention remains gently present throughout, without any stretch to it, simply noticing the falling itself as it happens. Not staying awake on purpose, mind you. Just not disappearing completely either. A soft, gentle kind of presence, somehow even within sleep itself. How would anyone even practice something like that? Most of those teachers suggest beginning with nothing more elaborate than this. As you feel sleep approaching, rather than fighting it or chasing it, simply rest your attention lightly on the sensation of falling itself, the way the breath slows, the way the room seems to grow distant, the way thoughts stop quite finishing themselves. You're not trying to stay awake against the falling. You're keeping a small, soft attention on the falling itself, the way you might watch snow settle without trying to catch any particular flake. Most nights, attention simply lets go on its own at some point, and that's entirely fine. The goal was never to outlast sleep. It was only to meet it a little more consciously than simply collapsing into it unaware, the way most of us do most nights without ever choosing to. Did Jivaka ever learn to do that himself? Or did he only ever teach it to other people? Later in his life, by most accounts, yes, though it apparently took him considerably longer than it took most of his own patients, which he was reportedly the first to admit. There's some humor whenever anyone pointed out the irony. There's something almost comforting in that detail, I think. The man who taught half a kingdom how to rest properly took his own time getting there himself. Wisdom about rest and the actual practice of resting don't always arrive together. Even in people who understand the principle perfectly well, you can know exactly how a string ought to be tuned and still spend years walking around with your own strung far too tight, simply because knowing and practicing are two entirely different muscles. Tenzin's eyes had grown noticeably heavy by now, without his quite noticing the exact moment it had happened. If there's some particular part of your own body still holding on to today, right now as you listen to this, your jaw, perhaps, or your shoulders, or your hands, or anywhere else at all, this might be a genuinely good moment to let it loosen just slightly. The way Jivaka eventually learned to allow his own body the same patient care he had always given so freely to everyone else's. And if you'd like, you're welcome to tell me in the comments which particular part of you is still holding on tonight. We're getting quite close now to the part of this story that matters most of all. Stay with me just a little longer. You're almost there, Ajahn Surya said quietly, watching Tenzin's breathing slow further, his eyelids growing heavier with every passing minute that went by. He said nothing more about it directly, not yet, not quite yet. Evan. What Sariputta knew, the fire was nearly out completely by now, just the faintest red thread buried somewhere deep within gray ash. More a memory of warmth at this point than warmth itself. The room had taken on the particular color of starlight and old stone, quiet now in a way that felt finally considerably less like simple absence and considerably more like genuine completeness. There was a disciple, Ajahn Surya said, his voice barely above a hush now, considered by many across many generations to be the wisest among all of the Buddha's many followers. His name was Sariputta. And what made him truly remarkable wasn't only the depth of his understanding, it was the particular way he carried that understanding with him, all the way to the very end of his own life. What was he known for before the end? And was he always so calm? By most accounts, no. He was known earlier in his life as exceptionally sharp, even combative in debate, the kind of mind that could dismantle an opposing argument with unsettling speed. That sharpness never entirely left him. It simply matured into something gentler over the decades, the same edge now used to cut through confusion rather than through opponents. He became known, later, for an almost endless patience with younger monks, willing to explain the same teaching 7 different ways until one of them finally landed. And people who'd known him only in his sharper youth were sometimes surprised by the warmth he showed in his final years, as though they were 2 different men. I don't think they were. I think the sharpness simply found, eventually, a kinder use. He grew old the way everyone eventually does, no exceptions, and his body in time began gradually to fail him. He knew with complete and total clarity that his own death was steadily approaching, not as some vague guess or uncertain feeling, but as something he understood the exact same way you might understand any other simple, settled fact of life. And here is what made him genuinely different from nearly everyone else who has ever faced that same particular knowledge. He didn't fight against it. He didn't try to bargain with it. He didn't lie awake at night in dread of it, the way so many of us almost certainly would, the way Tenzin himself had lain awake just nights ago over considerably smaller endings than this. He felt no fear of it at all then? None whatsoever? This is not a story about a man entirely unafraid of death, Ajahn Surya said slowly, each individual phrase given its own careful, deliberate weight. This is not a story about a man who had no remaining attachments left in his life to lose. This is not a story about a man simply being finished with living, as though life itself were merely some task to be completed and then quietly set aside. This is a story, instead, about a man who simply stopped arguing with the night, and by night here I mean every ending, large or small, that any of us are ever asked eventually to face in our own time. Tenzin lay very still, listening closely, his entire body heavy now in a way that felt considerably less like exhaustion and considerably more like a kind of gentle, gradual settling. And he spent his final days exactly the way he had spent most of the rest of his life, teaching gently wherever he was needed, attending patiently to small ordinary kindnesses, and completing each unremarkable task in turn without urgency and without any real dread attached to it. When the final moment eventually arrived, by most surviving account, he met it exactly the same way he had met everything else throughout his life, not with resistance, and not with any especially eager welcome either, simply with completion. The same way an ordinary day completes itself quietly at dusk, without anyone ever needing to argue the sun into actually setting. There's a detail in some of the older accounts, Ajahn Surya added. I find myself returning to more than almost anything else about him. In his final days, knowing what was coming, he asked to be taken back to the small room where he had been born in his home village, rather than remaining where he had spent most of his life teaching, not out of fear and not out of some last desperate attachment to the past. By his own explanation, It simply felt fitting. The same room where a life had begun was, to him, a reasonable enough place for it to end. There's nothing dramatic in that choice. No grand gesture, no final teaching delivered to crowds. Just a quiet man, returning to a quiet room, completing something that had started small and intended to end the same way. That seems almost too simple for someone considered the wisest of all the disciples. I think that's rather the point, if there is one. Wisdom, at its furthest edge, doesn't necessarily look impressive from the outside. It can look like nothing more than an old man going home to die in the room he was born in, declining every offer of elaborate ceremony, asking only for quiet. We tend to imagine enlightenment as something loud, visions, miracles, dramatic last words carved into history. And Sariputta's ending suggests something else entirely, that the most settled mind a person can develop might simply look, from any outside vantage point, like ordinary contentment, nothing to mark it as exceptional except perhaps, and its complete absence of struggle.
Do you think you'll go back to your own birth village when it's your time?
The question seemed to catch Ajahn Surya slightly off guard, though he recovered quickly enough that Tenzin almost missed it. I hadn't thought about it in those exact terms, but perhaps. It's a long way from here. I've made my peace with this mountain, being the place that holds whatever's left of me when the time comes. Sariputta's choice was his own, fitting his own particular life. Mine doesn't need to match it to be equally fitting. That's worth remembering about every story I've told you tonight. In fact, none of them are templates to copy exactly. They're simply proof that the underlying letting go is possible in whatever shape your own life happens to take. Parinibbana, Ajahn Surya said quietly, letting the words settle into the dim room. Final release. We usually only speak of that particular word at the very end of an entire life. But I think tonight you're close enough now to understand that it actually happens in miniature far more often than that, in ways most people never quite notice. Every single evening that ends without a fight is its own small parinibbana in its own small way. Every held breath that's finally allowed to let go completely is exactly the same thing, simply smaller in scale, simply far more frequent in how often it happens to all of us. Did Sariputta ever lie awake the way I have these last few nights, even once in his whole life? Almost certainly, yes. Especially in his earlier years before his understanding had fully ripened. The old texts don't dwell on it, because dramatic struggle makes for better storytelling than quiet adjustment, and so the records tend to skip ahead to the calm man at the end rather than lingering on whatever restlessnesses came before him. But no one arrives at that kind of ease without first having lain awake plenty of nights not having it. I think that's worth remembering, particularly at 3 in the morning, when it's easy to mistake someone else's hard-won stillness for something they were simply born with, rather than something they built, one difficult night at a time, the same as anyone else would have to. Tenzin found something in that almost more comforting than the story itself. The idea that even the wisest among them had once been exactly where he was now. Do you think that's true of everyone then? That no one arrives at peace without first lying awake plenty of nights without it? I haven't met an exception yet in all my years, though I've certainly met people who hid the sleepless nights well enough that you'd never have guessed from the outside. Sariputta's calm at the end wasn't the absence of a journey. It was the far side of one. I think people sometimes assume wisdom arrives like weather, that it simply happens to a person, unearned, while everyone else continues struggling. It doesn't. It accumulates the way water wears down stone, one ordinary night of patience sitting at a time, mostly invisible from the outside until, decades later, the shape of the stone has clearly changed. Is there a story about Sariputta failing at something? Or does it only ever get told as a story about someone who eventually got everything right? There's one I think about often, actually, though it's rarely the centerpiece of how he's remembered. Early in his discipleship, he reportedly misjudged a younger monk badly, assuming laziness where there was actually grief the young man hadn't yet found words for. and spoke to him more harshly than the situation warranted. And when he later understood his mistake, he didn't simply move past it quietly, the way someone protecting their own reputation might. He sought the young monk out directly, acknowledged the misjudgment plainly, without excessive self-flagellation but also without minimizing it, and asked what might actually help going forward. I find that story almost more instructive than his calm final days, in certain ways. It shows the wisdom wasn't the absence of mistakes. It was what he did immediately after making one. No defensiveness, no extended apology that made the moment about his own guilt rather than the other person's actual need. Just a clean correction and a genuine question about how to do better. Do you think you've made mistakes like that? With novices, I mean the way he did? More than I'd like to count, if I'm honest with you. I've misjudged exhaustion for resistance more than once. I've assumed silence meant agreement when it actually meant fear of disagreeing with someone senior to them. Tonight, sitting here with you, and I've likely already made some smaller version of the same mistake without yet realizing it, simply because that's what teaching across enough years and enough different young people eventually guarantees. Measure I try to hold myself to isn't whether I avoid the mistakes entirely. It's whether I notice them quickly enough and correct course honestly enough, the way Sariputta apparently did with that younger monk all those centuries ago. What happened to that younger monk in the end? The one Sariputta misjudged. By most accounts, he went on to become a capable teacher himself, eventually, and apparently spoke often of that particular correction as one of the formative moments of his own training. Not the harsh words themselves, which he reportedly forgave easily enough given how briefly they'd lasted, but the considerably rarer experience of watching someone senior to him acknowledge a mistake directly, without excessive ceremony, without needing the apology to become its own elaborate event. And he apparently carried that exact model forward into his own teaching decades later, making a point of correcting his own misjudgments quickly and plainly whenever he noticed them, rather than letting pride delay the correction the way pride so often does in people with any real authority to protect. Sometimes the most valuable thing a teacher passes down isn't the content of any particular teaching at all, and it's simply the example of how to recover well once you've gotten something wrong. He was quiet for a long moment afterward, and Tenzin noticed, in the dim, fading light, that the old monk's gaze had drifted once again toward the window, toward that same faint light out on the distant ridge that he had refused twice now to properly explain. "That hermitage out there," Ajahn Surya said finally, his voice considerably softer now, almost reluctant to continue. "That's the very place where I once nearly left for good many years ago now. I think it's finally time after everything tonight that I tell you exactly why I didn't." Tenzin sat up slightly in the dark, suddenly considerably more awake than he had been for the last hour or so. Not from any fear this time, but from the simple, quiet gravity of finally arriving somewhere the entire night had clearly been leading them both, one story at a time. "Tonight," Ajahn Surya said, settling himself more fully against the wall, as though preparing to carry something genuinely heavy the remaining distance to morning, "I'll finally tell you the story I promised you, all the way back when this entire night first began." Chapter 12. The night Ajahn Surya almost left Tenzin sat up a little straighter against the wall, the heaviness in his own limbs momentarily forgotten. He had waited the entire night for exactly this moment, through kings and killers and grieving mothers and frightened ascetics, and now finally the old monk was genuinely ready to tell it. "I was younger than you'd probably think when I first came here," Ajahn Surya began. 19, perhaps 20, no older than that. And I was, if I'm being entirely honest with you, exactly as afraid as you've been these last 3 nights running. Quite possibly more afraid, in fact, because I had no one there telling me careful stories to help make sense of any of it, the way I've been doing for you tonight. You? Genuinely afraid back then? "Terrified," he said simply, without any hesitation. "Not of any single particular thing, mind you. afraid of nearly everything at once, the way fear sometimes arrives, not as one clear, identifiable shape, but as a thick fog that somehow gets into absolutely everything it touches. I missed my own family considerably more than I could ever admit to anyone around me at the time. I doubted seriously whether I even belonged in these robes at all, whether any of it was the right choice. I lay awake night after night, entirely certain that everyone around me could see straight through my doubt. Exactly the way I worried earlier tonight, that you might think I could see straight through yours. Tenzin felt something shift inside himself. Not quite surprise exactly, but something close to genuine recognition, hearing his own private fear reflected back at him from decades before he had even been born. There was one particular night, Ajahn Surya continued, considerably worse than all the others that had come before it. I packed what little I actually owned at the time. I told myself I would leave well before dawn broke, walk straight down the mountain, and simply never come back here again. No explanation offered to anyone, no goodbye to anyone I'd grown close to. I made it as far as that very hermitage out on the ridge, the same one you noticed earlier tonight, and stopped there, telling myself it would be just one night's proper rest before continuing the rest of the way down in the morning. What happened to you there that night? I sat alone in that small, cold room and found I couldn't sleep at all, not unlike you these last few nights running. And somewhere in the middle of those long, difficult hours, an old teacher of mine found me there. He must have guessed, somehow, exactly where I had gone. He didn't scold me for it, not even slightly. He didn't beg me to stay either, the way I half expected him to. He simply sat with me there, the exact way I'm sitting here with you right now, and told me almost precisely what I've told you myself tonight, that a single sleepless night isn't some kind of final verdict on an entire life. That the particular fire keeping a person awake always feels eternal while it's actively burning, and never actually turns out to be eternal in the end. Anicca, impermanence extending even to the very worst nights imaginable. Was that enough on its own to make you decide to stay? Not entirely, not on its own, no. He told me one further thing that night, a teaching I hadn't properly heard before, called the Bhattacharya Sutta, the discourse on the ideal night. It says, more or less, that the truly ideal way to spend any single night isn't to chase endlessly after yesterday, replaying everything already finished and entirely unchangeable at this point. And it isn't either to fear tomorrow in advance, rehearsing every possible difficulty that hasn't even happened yet and quite possibly never will happen at all. The ideal night, instead, belongs only to whoever manages to simply see clearly whatever is actually here, right now, in this one single, unrepeatable moment. Nothing more than that is ever genuinely demanded of you. Tenzin lay very still, letting that particular teaching settle fully into him. I didn't leave that night, Ajahn Surya said, not because my fear had somehow vanished completely. It hadn't, not even close to vanishing. I stayed because, for the very first time in my life, I finally let that one difficult night simply be one night, not some referendum on my entire remaining life, not proof of every single doubt I happened to be carrying at the time. Just one genuinely difficult night that would eventually end, exactly the way every single night always does, sooner or later. He was quiet for a moment afterward, and something in the room felt noticeably different now, lighter, somehow, despite the real weight of the confession he had just offered. There's a king, he added after a pause, whose own story runs alongside mine in a strange parallel way, though he lived many centuries before either of us. Ashoka, a conqueror, ruthless in the early years of his reign, responsible for a brutal war that left an entire region in absolute ruin behind it. After it was finally over, walking slowly through what little remained of that widespread devastation, something genuinely broke open in him. He spent countless nights afterward entirely unable to sleep, haunted relentlessly by everything he had done, convinced that nothing could possibly undo any of it now. What eventually happened to him after all of that? He didn't run from the guilt, unlike how I had almost run from my own fear that night at the hermitage. None. He sat with it instead, eventually, the same way Angulimala had learned to sit with his own. How long did it take him to go from those sleepless, guilty nights to actually changing anything? Longer than people generally assume. They hear the story told quickly. It wasn't a single night's revelation followed immediately by stone edicts and a transformed kingdom. By most accounts, there were years of restlessness first, years of half measures and partial efforts before the fuller turn took hold. I mention that because I think people hearing tonight's stories might reasonably worry that if peace doesn't arrive in one dramatic night, the way it seemed to for Bahia, something has gone wrong. It hasn't. Bahia was the exception in the old text precisely because instant understanding is rare enough to be worth recording as a separate story. Ashoka's slower road, and mine, and very likely yours, is the considerably more common one. Slow doesn't mean failing, it only means ordinary. What did those stone edicts actually say? Do you remember any of it? Some of it, roughly. None. He had them carved in plain language, deliberately accessible to ordinary people, rather than written in the more formal court style of the time, which itself tells you something about what he'd come to value. And he wrote openly about his own past conduct, the Kalinga War among it, without the usual royal habit of softening or omitting the worst parts. He spoke of gentler governance, of treating subjects and even animals with consideration, of valuing restraint over conquest. What strikes me most even now isn't the content exactly. It's that a king with every available means to simply erase the record of his own worst chapter chose instead to carve it permanently into stone, in his own words, for anyone passing by to read for centuries afterward. None. That's not the act of someone trying to escape what he'd done. It's the act of someone who'd finally stopped needing to. And from that difficult sitting came an extraordinary transformation. He turned, fully and quite publicly, toward a considerably gentler way of ruling, carving his remorse and his renewed resolve directly into stone edicts that still stand today, all these centuries later, so that no one afterward would ever forget what guilt, not finally faced honestly rather than fled from, can eventually become. Did you ever think about carving anything after your own night at the hermitage? Writing any of it down the way he did? Nah. Ajahn Surya considered this longer than he'd considered almost anything else that night. Not in stone, no. But there's a small notebook kept somewhere in my quarters where I wrote down, the very next morning, exactly what my teacher had told me in his own words as close as I could remember them, before the memory had any chance to soften or improve itself the way memories tend to do over time. I've read it back perhaps a dozen times since across all these years. It's never once said anything different than what I remembered it saying the first time, which is, I suppose, its own small kind of carving, even without any stone involved. Some things are worth fixing in place exactly as they happened, before the years get the chance to round off their edges into something more comfortable than the truth actually was. What was your teacher like? You've never really told me about him directly, only about that one night. Stern, in the way old teachers often were in that particular era, though the sternness sat alongside a genuine warmth most novices only recognized years later. Once enough distance let them see the whole shape of it clearly. He wasn't given to easy praise, and I spent considerable energy as a young monk trying, mostly unsuccessfully, to earn more of it than he was inclined to offer. It wasn't until much later, well after his death, that I came to understand his restraint wasn't coldness at all. He simply didn't believe praise helped anyone develop genuine confidence, the kind that survives difficulty rather than collapsing the first time difficulty arrives. He'd rather a student trust their own clear seeing than trust his approval of it. I've tried to carry forward whatever I could of that particular wisdom in how I teach you and the others, though I won't pretend I've always managed his particular balance as well as he did. Do you think he'd be proud of you if he could see you now, teaching the way you do? Ajahn Surya was quiet for a long moment, something moving behind his eyes that Tenzin couldn't quite name. I think he'd recognize what I'm doing, which is its own kind of approval, coming from a man who rarely gave approval in words. Whether proud is the right word, I genuinely don't know. I think he'd simply nod the way he used to and say nothing further, trusting that the nod itself carried whatever needed to be carried. A king and a frightened young monk, Tenzin said softly, both kept awake all those years apart by exactly the same kind of fire. The very same fire, Ajahn Surya agreed. It rarely seems to matter how large or how small the surrounding life happens to be. The particular fire that keeps a person awake works exactly the same way whether you happen to be a king ruling an entire kingdom or a 15-year-old novice 3 nights into wearing his very first set of robes. He shifted his weight slightly, drawing the conversation gently toward its final turn. There's a hermit much later in history named Milarepa who spent long stretches of his own life entirely alone in remote caves, certain on some nights that the darkness itself held something genuinely monstrous, waiting patiently just beyond whatever he could actually see. What did he do on those nights alone with it? By his own account, he eventually stopped treating the cave as something to be defended against and started treating it as simply where he lived. There's a story, perhaps more legend than strict history at this point, of him waking one night to find demons crowding the cave around him, and rather than fighting them or fleeing, he offered them his own body as food. Having understood by then that resistance was what gave them their apparent solidity in the first place. The demons in the story simply dissolved once he stopped opposing them. Whatever you make of demons literally, the teaching underneath it holds up. Most of what terrifies us in the dark gets its power specifically from being resisted. Met without that resistance, it tends not to survive the meeting. And there's a teacher much closer to our own time, Ajahn Chah, who used to describe the completely untrained mind as a restless monkey, leaping endlessly from branch to branch, never once resting, grabbing eagerly at one thing only to immediately reach for the very next. Did he ever say how to actually stop the leaping or just describe it? Mostly the latter, by most accounts. He wasn't fond of tidy instructions that promised quick results. But he'd often add that the monkey doesn't need to be caught or punished or argued out of its branch leaping, and it only needs somewhere safe enough to eventually sit still on its own, which is a different task entirely than fighting it. You build the conditions. You don't force the stillness. Both of them, in their own particular ways, eventually learned the exact same thing I learned myself that night at the hermitage. That the leaping itself eventually slows down on its own, the very moment you stop chasing the monkey from branch to branch and simply allow it to tire itself out naturally. Bhavana, he said quietly. Cultivation, not forcing a calm mind into existence through sheer effort, but instead tending carefully to the conditions that allow calm to arrive entirely on its own schedule, the same way a garden grows according to its own time, regardless of how often anyone anxiously checks on it. Tenzin's eyes were heavy now, his breathing slow, and even in a way it simply hadn't been across the previous 3 full nights. I stayed, Ajahn Surya said, finishing where he had begun. Not because I stopped being afraid that particular night at the hermitage. Because I finally let one single night just be one night. Nothing more than that and nothing less either. Exactly the same teaching my own teacher once gave to me, the very same one I've just now given to you. He looked over at Tenzin and noticed, though he said nothing about it just yet, that the boy's breathing had changed entirely over just the last few minutes, considerably slower now, considerably deeper, settling into something neither of them had bothered to name out loud. Chapter 13. The ideal night by now, and the fire had gone out completely. Just cold ash remaining where real warmth had been earlier, and neither of them minded that in the slightest. The cold no longer seemed to matter somehow, the way it had mattered at the very start of the night. Very little did just now in this particular moment. Ajahn Surya looked over at Tenzin, whose eyes had drifted nearly closed by this point, his breathing slow and entirely unhurried, each inhale settling a little lower into his belly than the breath that had come just before it. "You know," the old monk said softly, more to himself now than directly to Tenzin. You stopped fighting it a while ago already. Somewhere around Jivaka's story, I think, if I had to guess exactly when. Your breathing changed, and you never even noticed it happening at the time. That's usually how it goes, my experience. The teaching lands in the body itself long before it ever properly finds its way into words. Tenzin made a small, sleepy sound in response, not quite a real reply, just a faint acknowledgement that he was still, barely, listening. "There's a woman much closer to our own time, named Dipama," Ajahn Surya continued, his voice quieter now than it had been at any other point all night, each word given plenty of room to settle fully before the next one arrived. "She lost nearly everyone she ever loved, one after another, in fairly quick succession, and spent years afterward entirely unable to find any real rest at all, grief keeping her awake exactly the way it once kept Kisa Gotami awake, the way it once kept Patakara wandering half-lost across the open countryside." He paused, the room settling around the pause. What made her different, in the end, from someone who simply never recovers? He answered his own question slowly, as much for himself now as for the boy beside him, half asleep. Nothing dramatic by most accounts. No single mustard seed, no single roadside teaching that changed everything in an instant. She practiced, ordinarily, patiently for years on. The same small attentions I've described to you tonight. Noticing a breath, noticing a fire, naming what was actually burning, rather than letting it remain one undifferentiated weight. She became eventually a teacher herself, known specifically for how she met people exactly where their suffering actually was, rather than where some teaching said it ought to be. I think that's the real lesson hidden in nearly every story I've told you tonight. If there's only one lesson to take from all of them, none of these people arrived at peace by skipping the difficult nights. They arrived by getting unusually good at simply getting through one more of them, and then another, without adding more to the weight than the night already carried on its own. "And there's a teacher, even closer still to our own time," he added, "who used to say that the breath itself is the only anchor anyone ever truly needs. Not because it solves anything on its own, not in any direct sense, but because it remains always available in every single moment, regardless of what particular kind of night you happen to be having. One breath, then another, right after it. That's genuinely all any of this ever really asks of you in the end." He thought briefly of all the nights of his own life this same teaching had quietly carried him through. Nights considerably harder than this one in some cases, and nights so ordinary they'd left no particular memory at all, which was, he supposed, its own kind of success. A teaching doesn't need to be remembered every single time it works. Most of the time, in fact, the better it works, the less anyone notices it working at all. He looked over at Tenzin once more, taking in note. For a long, quiet moment, the particular stillness of a boy who had arrived at this room 3 nights ago, rigid with fear, certain that one bad night meant some larger catastrophe was already underway, and who now lay here entirely undone by sleep, his face soft in a way faces only go when nothing at all is being defended against anymore. It was, Ajahn Surya thought, a small thing to witness and an enormous thing all at once. Not the resolution of anything large, not a permanent fix to whatever fears would inevitably return to Tenzin on some future night, weeks or months or years from now. Just one boy, on one particular night, finally letting one particular night be only that. Tomorrow's fears, whatever they turned out to be, would have to wait for tomorrow to arrive properly before they had any real claim on anyone's attention. Tonight had asked for exactly this much, and exactly this much had, in the end, been enough. The room had gone almost entirely silent by now, just the faint sound of 2 people breathing quietly in the dark. One slow and even, very nearly asleep already. The other patient, entirely unhurried, no particular rush at all to finish. Ajahn Surya thought, briefly, of every story he had told that night, the way you might glance back down a long road you'd just finished walking. Pasanati's 5 fires, and Anuruddha's ruined eyes, Sona's tuned string, Bahia's single sentence, Kisa Gotami's mustard seed, and the well rope that had frightened a boy for no reason at all. Padakara's feet washed clean by ordinary water, Angulimala learning to sit through his own dark, Yasodhara's long, quiet waiting, Jivaka's tired hands, Sariputa's calm completion, his own younger self, packed bag and all, now stopped on a cold ridge by a teacher who'd simply known where to look. 13 different people across more centuries than any single mind could properly hold, each one kept from rest by some fire that had, in the end, burned itself down to exactly this. An ordinary boy finally asleep in an ordinary room on an ordinary mountain. That was the whole of it, really. Not some grand secret reserved for the especially devoted. Just story after story, saying the same small thing in different voices until one voice finally was the right one for one particular boy on one particular night. That teaching I told you about earlier tonight, Ajahn Surya said, his voice barely above a whisper by this point. The ideal night, it doesn't actually ask you to solve your entire life before you're allowed to properly rest. It doesn't ask you to finish chasing yesterday first, or to finish fearing tomorrow first before you've somehow earned permission to close your eyes. It only ever asks you to see clearly whatever is actually here in this one single unrepeatable moment. Tonight, what's genuinely here is simply this: a cold stone room, a quiet mountain outside, and a breath that doesn't need anything further from you right now, not one single thing more. He let that settle for a long, comfortable moment, the silence between them entirely natural now in a way it hadn't quite been at the very start of the night. Parinibbana, he said softly, almost entirely to himself now. Final release, and we usually only ever speak of that particular word at the very end of an entire life. But it happens in miniature far more often than that. In fact, every single night, for absolutely anyone willing to let it happen. And every single breath that's finally allowed to finish completely, all the way down, without anyone arguing it into stopping too early. That's all that sleep really ever is. Underneath everything else we layer on top of it. A small, entirely ordinary kind of release repeated faithfully every single night across an entire life, asking nothing more of you ever than simple permission. Tenzin didn't answer this time. His breathing had gone fully even now, deep and entirely unhurried. The particular rhythm belonging to someone who has, somewhere in the last few minutes, without any single dramatic moment ever marking the actual change, finally and completely fallen asleep. Ajahn Surya smiled faintly there in the dark, watching him for a good while longer, in no particular hurry at all to move from where he sat. Outside, though neither of them could have said exactly when it had begun, the absolute black of the night had started, almost imperceptibly, to soften at its furthest edge. Not dawn itself, not yet, but the first faint suggestion that dawn remained as it always did, somewhere on its way regardless of how the night had gone. The old monk noticed it the way he noticed most things now, without urgency, without needing it to mean anything more than what it plainly was, one night, like every night before it, arriving eventually at its own natural end. He thought of all the other novices he had sat with over all the years in this same small room, more of them than he could easily count anymore. Each one carrying some particular fire that had felt to them entirely unprecedented, entirely theirs alone to bear. And each time the same handful of old stories had done the same quiet work, not because the stories were magic, but because the fires themselves were never quite as original as fear liked to insist. A boy 3 nights into his robes was rarely facing anything that hadn't already, in some recognizable shape, visited a king, a killer, a grieving mother, a frightened young monk on a cold ridge decades ago. That sameness wasn't a small thing. It was, in its own modest way, the entire comfort on offer. Not that the fire wouldn't come again, but that it had always, eventually, burned itself down to exactly this. Sleep well, he said quietly, to no one in particular now, since no one remained there to actually hear him. tomorrow night, if you happen to still be awake when I come to find you again, I'll have another story ready and waiting. There's always another one waiting somewhere for whichever particular fire happens to be burning on that night. He sat there a while longer in the cold, quiet room, watching the deep stillness settle fully over both of them, in no rush at all to do anything more than exactly this, nothing more and nothing less, the truly ideal night owned. Finally, for both of them, after everything, somewhere down the corridor, the monastery would soon enough begin its ordinary morning rhythm. The first bell, the soft shuffle of robes, the smell of rice beginning to cook in the kitchen below. None of that had arrived yet, for now there was only this, an old monk keeping quiet watch, a young novice finally at rest, and a mountain holding both of them the way it had held so many others before, patiently, without needing either of them to be anything other than exactly what they were in this single, unrepeatable moment. If tonight's stories helped some of your own particular fires settle, even just slightly, I'd genuinely love for you to stay with this place a while longer. There's a new story waiting most weeks, for whichever night you happen to need it most. And if you're already half asleep yourself, as I rather sincerely hope you are by now, then there's truly nothing left to do at all. Just let this be the last thing you hear tonight. Sleep well.